If the Earth were nothing more than a testing ground, who would be doing the observing, and what would the experiment hope to learn? That single question hangs like a keystone above every other thought about origin, purpose, and scale. It is a question that compresses centuries of geology, biology, and myth into one small syllable of doubt. What if the grand story of life here is not the main story at all, but a specimen under the lens of some greater curiosity? The thought is both intoxicating and unnerving. It dislodges familiar certainties and substitutes a different frame. The planet not a stage for human drama, but as a stage prop inside someone else's laboratory. From this vantage, humans may be protagonists, or they may be tokens, cells in a petri dish, subjects in an ethics-free trial, objects of an art installation designed to elicit a particular response. The first thing to notice about this idea is its insistence on scale. Deep time is the metric that gives the conceit its plausibility. Geological strata read like the spines of an unread book. Ice cores, tree rings, and sedimentary layers act as archivists, recording chemistry and climate, carrying whispers of what came and what was erased. Seen from a perspective that spans millions of years, human lives are instantaneous. Even the longest-lived civilizations flicker across the record like the flash of a camera strobe. If there is an observer, they have either exceptional patience or instruments that compress time and render centuries into a moment. The question of who watches therefore folds into a question about temporal perspective, an entity that can process deep time as a single dataset, or a mind that lives long enough to care about the slow history of a planet. For the observer, the most natural reading of Earth is as a variable in a controlled experiment. On the most straightforward interpretation, the planet is a box in which conditions can be set, change introduced, and outcomes measured. Atmosphere composition, continental arrangement, solar flux, extinction events, each becomes a dial to be turned. In this frame, mass extinctions might be not only ecological catastrophes but also built-in resets. They are experiments in resilience. How will life respond to sudden losses? How quickly will complexity re-emerge? The Cambrian explosion, the Ordovician die-off, the Cretaceous fall of dinosaurs. Each episode would be data points demonstrating the range and elasticity of biological systems. When confronted with dramatic perturbations, another class of observers would not be experimentalists in the laboratory sense, but curators. They watch to preserve, to archive, to catalogue the diversity of living systems. The Earth becomes a living museum, an attempt to conserve types, forms, and emergent behaviors in a repository that can later be queried, studied, or even displayed. In that role, the observer's motive would not be to stimulate change, but to capture it. The ethics here complicate. Preservation requires non-interference, but cataloging often demands intervention, sampling, removal, measurement. If humans were a species within that museum, then their cultures, myths, and technologies would be artifacts. The question shifts. Are they on display because they are interesting, or because they demonstrate something about the observers themselves? There is another, darker possibility, that the planet is a testbed designed not for knowledge but for entertainment. In this scenario, the trial is a narrative economy, where the unpredictable emergence of intelligence and the drama of social systems are spectacles. The Earth becomes a slow, unfolding story whose arcs are allowed to play out for the amusement of distant audiences. This is a cynical mirror of human behavior. Civilizations that stage reality television, or that put animals in enclosures to watch how they behave. If that were so, the observer's intentions would be cruelly indifferent to the subject's suffering, since pain and tragedy fuel narrative. The thought is chilling because it reduces human meaning to spectacle, yet, paradoxically, it is not impossible to imagine that curiosity can take the shape of entertainment. A subtler variant is the rehearsal hypothesis. Perhaps the Earth is an experimental stage where social, technological, and ecological strategies are tested to refine them for application elsewhere. In that case, humanity may be unwitting actors in a trial and error process. Cultural innovations, governance structures, moral codes, even religions could be seen as emergent algorithms that the observers sample, select, and tweak. Which systems produce stability, which propagate resilience, which collapse spectacularly. The Earth as rehearsal model reads human history as prototyping, an extended beta test whose output will influence decisions about futures beyond this planet. If any of these frameworks holds true, then the observer's method matters as much as their motive. Observation can be passive, vast arrays of instruments, hyper-accurate telescopes and sensors that simply record, Or it can be active, seeding events, nudging climate, introducing pathogens, or even guiding cognitive leaps. In the passive case, human freedom is preserved. In the active case, autonomy becomes an experimental variable. The record, what survives in the geological and cultural memory, provides clues. Sudden spikes in artifact complexity, seemingly abrupt technological leaps, or inexplicable cultural shifts could be interpreted as stochastic variations or as evidence of intervention. The mind is tempted to prefer patterns. It strings anomalies into a narrative because stories provide meaning where randomness would otherwise reign. Speculation about observers invites speculation about their identity. There might be other biological civilizations, older and more patient. They might be post-biological intelligences, machines evolved from earlier minds whose temporal horizons stretch into the millennia. They might be organisms that perceive time differently, living at speeds or slownesses that render human epochs as either instantaneous flares or protracted sagas. Alternatively, the observers may not be who at all, but what, a planetary scale intelligence, an algorithm running across the galactic web, or a process that uses planet-sized testbeds to calibrate universal laws. Each carries different implications. A biological observer suggests motives akin to curiosity or survival. A machine observer suggests optimization, simulation, and the cold calculus of data. The less anthropomorphic the observer, the stranger and less moral their aims might appear. The hypothesis that Earth is a testing ground also wrestles with the possibility of prior civilizations long erased by time. Deep time thinking entertains the notion that complex societies could have risen and fallen millions of years before hominins walked upright. Traces of such possibilities would be subtle. Geological processes are excellent erasers. Plate tectonics devours ruins, rivers oxidize metals, and microbes corrode monuments into indistinguishable sediments. Yet the planet's historical memory is not entirely blank. Isotopic anomalies, strange manufacturing residues in ancient strata, or atypical concentration developments might hint at activity beyond natural processes. Whether such signatures will be recognized by distant observers as proof of a vanished intelligence, or whether they would be easy to mistake for geological whim, depends on the observer's analytical frameworks. On the human side, the prospect of being a specimen under observation produces a mix of emotional responses: wonder, dread, indignation, relief. Wonder arises from the possibility of participation in a larger cosmological story. Dread comes from the loss of agency implied by being observed for someone else's ends. Indignation springs from the ethical asymmetry, subjects studied without consent. Relief can be found in the thought that the universe is not indifferent, that there is a watcher means that existence has been noticed. These feelings are not uniform. They ripple differently across cultures, beliefs, and temperaments. Some find solace in being part of a grand experiment. Others recoil at the thought of being clinical data points. Ethical questions follow quickly. If some intelligence observes Earth, what obligations do they have toward their subjects? If they can alter climate, influence minds, or remove organisms from the planet, then the scale of ethical responsibility is enormous. The observer's toolkit is wide. They could intervene to prevent extinction, or they could refrain in order to preserve the integrity of their data. The choice between interference and non-interference is itself a moral variable. Human thought has grappled with this dilemma in microcosm. Medical trials, wildlife studies, and historical anthropology all wrestle with consent, harm, and benefit. The cosmic version magnifies the stakes. Entire biospheres are at issue, and decisions echo across epochs. The idea of surveillance also alters the human self-conception. Self-awareness grows asymptotically when subjects imagine being watched. Societies create rituals, myths, and taboos about the gaze. Religions claim omnipresent deities. Moral systems adjust to a presumed watcher. The knowledge, real or imagined, that they are a specimen might give rise to new philosophies: resignation, rebellion, attempts to contact or deceive the observer, or the cultivation of a private life that is known only to other humans. Even if no external watcher exists, the thought that one might be watching transforms behavior. There is power in a psychological shiver, and it has shaped human cultures for as long as they have speculated about gods, ancestors, and hidden eyes. A documentary storyteller can probe these layers not by insisting on answers, but by mapping out consequences and possibilities. The aim is not to declare truth, but to expand the reader's imagination while remaining tethered to observation, the slow burn of geological time, the fragility of continental records, the peculiarities of sudden change. For instance, when a narrator describes a site of mass extinction, The words do more than catalogue the event. They invite the listener to consider whether that die-off was simply the result of asteroid and climate, or whether it could be a controlled variable. When the narrator traces the sudden rise of tool use and collective memory in hominins, the voice suggests both the wonder of emergent intelligence and the possibility that such emergence was anticipated, even encouraged. There's almost a literary pleasure in considering the Earth as a specimen. The planet becomes a paradoxical object, intimate and inaccessible, rich in story but mute about motive. It is a place where bones, sediments, and folklore are all evidence, yet none give definitive testimony about intent. If an observer exists, their testimony would be decisive. The lack of direct evidence is either proof of their discretion or a sign that no such observer exists. That tension, the unclosed loop between evidence and inference, generates the drama. It is the same dramatic engine that drives archaeology and cosmology. The fossil fragment and the cosmic background both whisper, and humans, being pattern-seeking mammals, must decide whether to trust the whisper as message or as noise. There is also an aesthetic dimension. Framing Earth as an experiment highlights patterns that might otherwise be mundane. Planetary climates become test conditions, coral reefs are living laboratories, social revolutions are emergent phenomena to be modeled. This view reframes wonder. It suggests that the beauty of a biosphere is not diminished by being observed, but that beauty acquires an objectivity, an aesthetic that can be quantified, compared, and catalogued. For an observer, beauty could be data. For humanity, the realization that beloved landscapes might be variables in a study produces both melancholy and a new appreciation for form. Ultimately, the strength of this speculative documentary question lies not in yielding a definitive answer, but in reshaping perspective. To ask whether humans are the main characters or specimens is to interrogate human narcissism and to humble it. Whether the planet is a testing ground or not, the exercise is salutary. It forces a confrontation with scale, with time, and with the limits of human perception. It urges that humanity examine its records with greater care, that it protect the fragile traces of intelligence and culture, and that it cultivate ethical thinking appropriate to the possibility of being observed. The question returns to its opening form and, like any good scientific hypothesis, invites inquiry. If this is an experiment, then what predictions does it make? What anomalies would validate it, and what observations would refute it? Could humans design techniques, new methods of archaeology, deeper sediment analysis, or novel ways of reading isotopic signatures that lessen the ambiguity? The answer is both pragmatic and philosophical. More data will reduce uncertainty, but it will not eliminate the ultimate mystery of motive. An observer can always be more sophisticated than the instruments that seek them. So, the thought lingers, a rivulet of doubt that widens into a river of speculation. Is Earth a tasting ground? Who watches and why? There is no definitive voice that answers. Instead, there are possibilities, scientists, curators, entertainments, rehearsals, algorithms, each casting its own light and shadow. The most significant consequence is not the correct hypothesis, but the change in comportment it begets. Small and temporary, humans stand before a history longer than comprehension. Whether they are protagonists or specimens, what can be controlled is how they act in the brief, luminous span of their presence. With curiosity, with care, with courage, and with the humility to accept that some questions may be asked not to be answered, but to be lived. What if the planet were read not as a scene, but as a protocol? What if the familiar tableau of sky, sea, and smoldering rock were, at their most elemental, the components of a single enormous experiment laid out, calibrated, and left to run? That question is the hinge of the image that follows. The Earth is a primordial workbench assembled from water, air, and fire, with all its parts arranged as though someone had been preparing instruments for a trial whose timescale outruns comprehension. The image is deliberately simple, and therefore strange. In the mind's eye, the globe becomes a laboratory bench the size of a world. Oceans are wide glass basins, their currents stirred like solutions by invisible hands. The atmosphere is a nebulous hood, a controlled atmosphere chamber in which gases are mixed, depleted, and replenished. Volcanoes and mantle plumes act as Bunsen burners beneath the bench, providing pulses of heat and chemistry. Ice sheets are refrigerators, deserts and salt flats are desiccators. Across this bench, gradients are the true apparatus, differences in temperature, salinity, pressure, redox potential. These gradients are the pipettes and burettes of planetary chemistry. Wherever liquids meet minerals, wherever heat meets cold, wherever the spark of electricity touches a volatile mix, Reactions take place that neither geology nor biology could have forecast alone. To treat the planet as a laboratory is to notice the deliberate seams of its construction. The early Earth, as it formed from dust, behaved very much like an experiment being set up. Gravity sorted mass into a dense core and an outer shell. Differentiation was the centrifuge at work. The primordial atmosphere, a thick, volatile blanket, condensed and thinned in cycles, modulating the greenhouse effect. As the young world cooled, water condensed to form oceans that would become the laboratory solvent, the medium for chemistry. The arrangement of continents and basins established shelves and trenches, shallow warm kitchens for chemistry on one hand, and deep, high-pressure autoclaves on the other. Tectonics began to shuffle the deck, continents drifted, collided, and rifted apart, reshaping currents and climates as if the observer were changing boundary conditions between trials. There is an almost clinical elegance in how water, gas, and fire interact. Water carries ions, dissolves minerals, and creates interfaces, coastlines, tidal pools, hydrothermal vents where concentration gradients form. These interfaces are where chemistry tends to happen. Molecules come together in greater numbers than chance would otherwise allow. Air made of nitrogen, carbon dioxide, oxygen, and noble gases is the breath of the experiment, its composition changing as volcanic outgassing, photosynthesis, and weathering alter the mix. Fire, volcanic heat, lightning, the heat of impact, drives reactions that would not occur at ambient temperatures. Put these three together and the conditions for complexity arise. Energy flows into locally reduced order, and life, or life-like chemistry, becomes a possible outcome of that flow. Consider the early sea, reheated again and again by impacts and inflationary interior heat. In this view, hydrothermal vents are not just curiosities of the deep, they are microfactories. Controlled hot plates where mineral surfaces catalyze reactions and create pockets of order. In shallow tidal pools, the intermittent wetting and drying act like cyclic incubators. Concentration phases alternate with dilution, favoring polymerization of molecules that, in a perpetually wet environment, would remain too diffuse to interact. Lightning across a methane-laced atmosphere is a strobe, briefly providing high-energy electrons that break and reform bonds. The point is not to romanticize these features, but to recognize them as repeatable experimental conditions: heat, cycles, concentration, catalytic surfaces, and time. Time itself is a critical instrument on this bench. In most labs, an experiment's duration is finite and controlled. On Earth, durability and patience are the tools. The timescale here is staggering, millennia folded into human seconds. For an observer able to think on geologic scales, the slow unfolding of a planet is a convenient affordance. Plate tectonics recycles the crust on timescales of hundreds of millions of years. Ice ages wax and wane across tens of thousands. If an external mind were running trials, those cycles would be a way to iterate, to nudge a system and see how it resets after perturbation. The record of these iterations is the strata, the ice cores, the layers of ash and silt, the logbook of the experiment. Imagining Earth as a lab requires attention to variables and controls. Which conditions are held constant, which are dialed? Solar input is a primary constraint, given relatively steady, but slowly increasing as a star ages. Other variables are more malleable. The composition of the atmosphere can change, either by chance through volcanic episodes or slowly via weathering and biotic processes. The presence of continents affects ocean circulation and nutrient cycling. Impactors, asteroids, and comets are stochastic perturbations that can reset trajectories. In an experimental metaphor, a responsible observer might decide to vary one parameter at a time. In planetary practice, variation is messy and correlated. Yet across eons, different combinations of parameters have been sampled, yielding different outcomes: oxygenation, glaciation, greenhouse epochs, and mass die-offs. Each outcome is data. There are moments when the laboratory analogy becomes uncomfortably literal. Consider mass extinctions, those abrupt drops in biodiversity etched across the fossil record. In the lab, they would be equivalent to deliberate resets, sterilizations between trials. In the history of Earth, these events allow ecosystems to reorganize under new boundary conditions, providing different pathways for complexity to emerge. Or take the oxygenation of the atmosphere, an accretion of a waste product from photosynthetic organisms that, fundamentally, altered the chemical landscape, enabling aerobic metabolism and, eventually, large-bodied animals. That change reads like a staged experiment in which a species' metabolic waste became an environmental lever, reshaping the entire system. Viewed this way, certain planetary features begin to function as apparatus, The moon stabilizes tilt and thus moderates seasons. Mountain chains force climate gradients, and rain shadows, polar ice caps act as temperature buffers. These are not incidental details, but crucial pieces of an experimental setup that determine boundary conditions. A planet without a satellite of similar scale, or without plate tectonics, might be a very different bench with profoundly different experimental outcomes. What would an observer gain by arranging matter this way? The answer depends on the observer's purpose. If curiosity is the motive, then variety matters. A planet that hosts a wide array of environmental states is a rich source of information about what works and what fails. If preservation is the goal, then isolation and stability are preferred, features that protect diversity from wholesale destruction. If entertainment is the aim, drama, unpredictable, sensorially vivid events may be intentionally permitted. The point is not to adjudicate motives, but to note that the kinds of experiments the Earth facilitates are as varied as its geology. Stress tests of resilience, long-term studies of coevolution, or spontaneous theaters of contingency. Humanity's emotional response to considering the planet as a bench is complex. The first emotion is vertigo, the sense of shrinking in a vista of endless time and scale. The second is wonder, an aesthetic appreciation for the intricate choreography of processes that have produced fertile chemistry and, ultimately, cognition capable of contemplating itself. The third is unease, a suspicion of being a result rather than an author, a product of conditions selected by factors beyond any human purview. These affective states are not rooted in specific narratives or conversations, but in the architecture of scale itself. They are the response of a species suddenly aware that the most intimate things, breath, blood, thought, are knotted to planetary processes far larger than the lifespan of any individual. The bench metaphor also exposes ethical considerations. In a laboratory, subjects can be sacrificial, exposed to harm for the sake of knowledge. If the planet were indeed an experimental setup, the ethics of non-interference would come into play. Observers might choose to alter conditions to reduce suffering, or they might refrain to preserve data fidelity. On a planetary scale, such moral choices are magnified to existential proportions. The same consideration has its microcosm in human history, when humans study other animals, when medical researchers design trials. Ethical frameworks are brought to bear: consent, harm-benefit analyses, minimization of suffering. Proportionally expanded, the question becomes whether an observer has the duty to protect or the right to observe. Another layer of the image is the invisibility of construction. Laboratory technicians do not always leave identifiable traces in their instruments. They calibrate, tune, and withdraw. Over millions of years, geological processes erase the marks of intervention. Metals oxidize, structures collapse, isotopic anomalies dilute. Even if deliberate seeding or manipulation occurred in deep time, the evidence will be subtle, requiring tools and interpretive frameworks that humans currently lack. The metaphor of a lab both comforts and confounds. It offers an orderliness to chaos and yet promises that evidence may be forever obscured by the planet's own dynamics. There is also a poetic truth to the arrangement of water, air, and fire. These three elements are not merely background conditions. They are the media of possibility. Water dissolves and transports. Air transmits gases and thermal gradients. Fire initiates reactions. Their interaction creates the disequilibrium that life exploits. Where equilibrium reigns, life fades. It is the exploitation of gradients, energy differentials, that powers metabolic pathways. In this way, the planet's arrangement resembles the simplest experimental principle: create a gradient, see what happens. What emerges is not predetermined, but constrained. Increasing oxygen favors aerobic metabolisms. Larger size and complex morphologies, anoxic periods, favor chemolithotrophic organisms and microbial dominance. If the Earth is an apparatus, it is also an evolving one. Laboratories do not always remain static. Tools wear, reagents exhaust, conditions drift. On geological timescales, continents grow and erode, climates shift, and the availability of critical nutrient cycles. An observer who understands this would not think of the bench as a single experiment, but as a program of linked trials, each building on the outcomes of previous runs. That layered history is what produces cumulative novelty. Chemical systems become biological. Local ecosystems become planetary networks of nutrient flux and climate regulation. The cumulative nature of this system is what makes the idea of rehearsal plausible. If an observer wanted to refine strategies for complex life or societies, there is no better method than to allow variation over eons and sample the emergent solutions. The discipline of making such an image useful, rather than merely speculative, rests on recognizing both the power of patterns and the limits of inference. Geological strata, isotopic anomalies, fossil occurrences, and planetary dynamics are the primary data. They can be read in many ways. Interpreting them as the output of an experimental design is an imaginative act grounded in observation but not constrained by it. The task of documentary thinking is to use that imaginative act to illuminate consequences, to examine how such a conceit would change human self-understanding and how it might reframe priorities, conservation, stewardship, careful archiving of knowledge. If the bench metaphor produces humility, then it performs a civic function. It makes the fragility and contingency of human presence more palpable. Perhaps the most haunting facet of the primeval panoramic image is its reciprocity. The laboratory metaphor is inevitably anthropocentric. Humans assume that observation implies design, that complexity implies authorship. Yet the planet might be both apparatus and unintended emergent system. The very processes that look like neat experimental setups, gradients, cycles, compartmentalization, are also natural consequences of physics and chemistry. The beauty of the analogy lies not in proving intent, but in sharpening questions. If the earth were assembled to produce life, what would that say about the value of life? If it merely happened to be so conducive, what does that say about the rarity and wonder of the cosmic dice roll that produced it? In the quiet that follows such speculation, there is a practical corollary. Whether or not an external observer arranged the bench, humans themselves are now capable of rearranging conditions on their own little corner of the workbench. Industrial combustion alters the atmospheric composition. Landscape engineering changes albedo and runoff. Biodiversity loss removes experiments in progress whose outcomes were still unread. The power to alter variables on a global scale is a new kind of observer privilege, local but consequential. The irony is thick. Species that wondered whether they were specimens are becoming, in effect, experimenters in their own right, poorly coordinated, imperfectly informed, but immensely effective. The primal panoramic image, Earth as a lab of water, air, and fire, thus serves as more than metaphor. It is a lens that brings into focus the interdependence of geological and biological phenomena, the centrality of flux and gradient to complexity, and the ethical questions that follow from the possibility of observation. It enlarges perspective without resolving motive. It invites a posture of careful curiosity, to read the strata closely, to preserve fragile archives, to experiment with humility, and to act with the kind of deliberation that reverence for deep time demands. In the end, the experiment, if indeed there is one, continues whether watched or unobserved. The bench is active, oceans circulate, atmospheres breathe, magma stirs. New gradients form, old ones dissipate. The record accrues, layer upon layer, a palimpsest waiting for interpreters capable of thinking in eons. The question, is this a test? Therefore stands less as a demand for answer than as a summons to careful attention. Humans are, in the smallest sense, both subjects and stewards. They are observers of the only laboratory they currently know, and that experience carries with it not merely existential unease, but also an ethical imperative to treat the apparatus with its fragile interlocks of water, air, and fire with a respect earned through long observation and cautious intervention. What holds the laboratory together is not a calendar or a schedule, but rock, molten and solid, folded into rhythms that outlast empires. The planet's crust, mantle, and core form the foundation of any experiment that might be run here, a living, restless stage beneath the scenes of life. To imagine Earth as a laboratory is to begin, inevitably, with its geology, the infrastructure that makes gradients possible, that channels heat and chemicals, and that sets the bounds within which chemistry and biology tinker with possibility. At the heart of this foundation are volcanoes, tectonic plates, and oceans, three systems that, taken together, function like a planet-scale control suite. Volcanoes are the laboratory burners and reagent injectors. They puncture crustal seams with heat and fresh material, bringing deep chemical stocks to the surface and altering atmospheres with each plume. Tectonic plates are the conveyors and architects. They rearrange the bench, creating shelves, basins, and passageways for currents and weather. Oceans are the circulating pumps, distributing heat, transporting nutrients, and diluting or concentrating chemical signals. Each plays a role in setting experimental boundary conditions, and together they maintain the planet's capacity to hold complex chemistry in sustained disequilibrium. Volcanoes, in the geological imagination, are not random acts of destruction, but calibrated outgassers. They vent the planet's interior, sulfur, carbon dioxide, water vapor, trace metals into the envelope where life and weather interact. The chemical cocktails they deliver can be subtle nudges or planetary resets. A prolonged pulse of carbon dioxide raises the greenhouse thermostat, inviting warmth. A spike of sulfur can dim sunlight, cooling the surface on geological timescales. In the laboratory metaphor, volcanic eruptions adjust concentrations, add catalysts, change pH, and alter redox potentials. They deliver not only heat, but raw material from mineral catalysts that participate in prebiotic and biotic chemistry. The ash that rains down can bury ecosystems, seeding new substrates for ecological succession. The lava that flows reworks topography, creating new shelves and isolating basins. In this light, eruptions are both perturbations and opportunities, dangerous yet generative. Tectonics works at a slower, patient tempo. Plate motions build mountain ranges that reorder atmospheric circulation, carve rain shadows, and create microclimates. Continental drift alters the geometry of ocean basins, which in turn reshapes currents and the distribution of heat and nutrients. When continents assemble into supercontinents, ocean circulation tightens into particular patterns. When they rift, fragmentation increases continental margin area, creating more shallow seas, the cradles of biodiversity. Subduction zones serve as long-term recycling plants, dragging surface carbon and crustal materials back into the mantle. The deep carbon cycle, mediated by plate tectonics and volcanism, is a regulator of atmospheric composition over millions of years. Viewed from a systems perspective, plate tectonics is the experimenter's slow hand. It rearranges the container, alters boundary conditions, and thereby changes the ensemble of possible outcomes for life. The oceans, for their part, are the planetary circulatory system, driven by wind, Coriolis forces, and the temperature-salinity gradients created by soil input and freshwater fluxes. Currents carry heat poleward and nutrients from abyssal sources into sunlit realms. Upwelling zones inject mineral riches into surface waters, fueling blooms that draw down carbon, while the deep ocean sequesters organic carbon for eons. The ocean is a dynamic stabilizer. It buffers atmospheric swings by dissolving gases, taking up heat and acting as a slow-release reservoir of chemical reagents. On timescales of centuries to millennia, ocean circulation can flip or slow, with dramatic consequences for regional climates and biospheric productivity. For an observer who views experiments in terms of feedback and control, the ocean is a master regulator, a set of pumps and valves whose settings determine much of the biosphere's productivity and resilience. Overlaid on these three systems is a thinner, deceptively fragile membrane, the atmosphere. Like a glass hood on a laboratory bench, the atmosphere isolates and defines internal conditions. It provides pressure sufficient for liquid water to exist. It modulates the planet's thermal budget, and it maintains chemical gradients that drive metabolism. Its composition, a mix of nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, water vapor, and trace gases, is both a product and an instrument of planetary processes. Changes in atmospheric constituents are the most immediate dials available for shifting experimental conditions. A rise in greenhouse gases, whether from volcanic outgassing or the metabolic waste of photosynthetic organisms, shifts thermal equilibria. Oxygenation opens pathways for new metabolisms and larger body plans. The loss or gain of aerosols alters sunlight penetration and can precipitate climate tipping points. The analogy of a glass hood carries a suggestive image, a sealed chamber where the outside world cannot easily intrude, where conditions are held within limits so that reactions proceed in a controlled way. The atmosphere, however, is less sealed than the hood of a benchtop apparatus. It exchanges with space via the escape of light gases, and with the planet's interior via outgassing and subduction. It responds to the living respond to it. It is both container and participant. In terms of experimentation, this ambiguity complicates any clean separation between control and subject. The atmosphere is simultaneously medium and variable, reagent and outcome. Taken together, volcanoes, tectonic motion, oceans, and the atmosphere do more than maintain life-friendly conditions. They impose a structure of constraints that channels what can emerge. Gradients of temperature, salinity, redox potential, pressure, and chemical concentration are the engines of complexity. Where a gradient is sharp and persistent, chemical systems can exploit it to do work, assemble polymers, concentrate molecules, maintain disequilibrium. Where gradients are shallow or ephemeral, complexity struggles to take hold. That is why the choreography of Earth's geological systems matters so much. The arrangement of continents, the frequency of volcanic pulses, the pattern of oceanic circulation. All these determine whether gradients form and persist, and therefore whether complexity has room and time to arise. This geological scaffolding also explains why some planetary configurations fail to become laboratories in the same sense. A world without tectonics will struggle to recycle volatiles. A planet with a stagnant lid will not create the diverse, continental margin habitats that foster evolutionary experimentation. A world with an atmosphere too thin will not sustain long-lived surface liquid water. One with an atmosphere too dense will drown. The fine gradients life uses to organize, the combination of a molten interior, mobile plates, a temperate atmosphere, and vast oceans, is precarious and perhaps uncommon. From an experimental point of view, the value of Earth lies precisely in that precarious balance. It provides a wide phase space for testing configurations and watching which pathways lead to persistence. There is, in this geological narrative, a melancholic undertone. The very forces that create experimental niches are also agents of erasure. Tectonic recycling consumes the physical traces of past runs. Mountains rise and fall. Erosion smooths terraces into undifferentiated rubble. Subduction consumes oceanic crust and anything built on it. The fossil record is therefore partial and biased, a museum with whole galleries missing. If someone were running long-term trials here, the record available to later analysts would be fragmentary at best. This is a crucial point. Geology both enables and obscures. It produces the gradients that make life possible, and it scrubs the evidence that life once left as it experiments again and again. Humanity's emotional register, when it contemplates these forces, is a blend of awe and vertigo. There is awe at the raw power of magmas that can birth islands from the sea, of mantle convection that over vast epochs sculpts continents, of currents that ferry warmth to frozen coasts. There is vertigo when the scale of these processes swallows human concerns, the mountain that took tens of millions of years to uplift, the ocean circulation that can reorganize in centuries, the atmospheric composition that can shift in a few generations under industrial pressure. That vertigo yields a sense of smallness, yes, but it also kindles responsibility. If humans are an intelligent product of these processes, their understanding must extend to stewardship. The intimacy between geological machinery and life suggests that any serious custodian of the planet must learn to read and respect the mechanisms that sustain it. This recognition has practical implications. Geological processes are not merely the backdrop for conservation. They define the speed and scale at which interventions will work. Alter the atmospheric composition, and the climate will respond with its own inertia, buffering effects and delayed feedbacks. Rework land surfaces, and the hydrological cycle will shift, with consequences downriver and downwind. Extract resources quickly, and the geological and ecological systems that depend upon them will degrade on timescales that may be long compared to political cycles, but short compared to the planet's capacity to repair itself. The laboratory analogy becomes more the metaphor when it guides action. To change the system is to change the experiment. To be responsible is to design interventions that acknowledge geological tempos. There is also a tension in the image of geology as the laboratory's foundation. The very features that stabilize the system can become constraints, limiting the range of experiments that can sensibly be run. A stable climate and long-lived continents allow for slow accumulation of complexity, but they also map into a kind of conservatism that resists radical reconfiguration. Rapid, large-scale attempts to push the system into new regimes can produce irreversible outcomes. That is why the ethics of planetary-scale experimentation, whether by hypothetical external observers or by the species that currently occupies the bench, demand prudence. Geological time is not lenient. Some changes cannot be reversed within human-relevant timelines. Viewed from the speculative documentary vantage built in the earlier parts of this series, the geological structure suggests why a rational observer might choose Earth as an experimental arena. It combines a rich set of variables, mobile surfaces, active volcanism, a voluminous ocean, a temperate atmosphere, and an internal dynamo that produces a magnetic field shielding the surface from solar stripping. It offers gradients of every kind, distributed across an immense canvas and modulated by mechanisms that operate across a tremendous range of timescales. For observers interested in the emergence and resilience of complexity, Earth's geological architecture is a nearly ideal stage. Yet, in keeping with the documentary's measured approach, it is important not to overwrite the natural with the teleological. The same gradients that look like experimental apparatus are also straightforward consequences of physics and chemistry acting on. A rocky planet bathed in solar flux and endowed with internal heat. There is an ambivalence here. The planet's suitability for complexity could be an emergent accident rather than an arranged set of conditions. The geological narrative, then, refuses an easy conclusion. It supplies both the mechanisms that make experimentation possible and the reason to hesitate before ascribing purpose. If the planet is a lab, its instruments are many and their operations subtle. The core generates a magnetic shield that preserves the atmosphere. The mantle convects, powering plates and volcanism. Surface erosion redistributes materials. Oceans circulate and modulate climate. Together they sustain a dynamic balance in which life can arise, flourish, and occasionally stumble into catastrophe. The image that remains, that of water, air, and fire orchestrated by the slow machines of geology, invites a reverent curiosity. It asks those who listen to learn not only the immediate chemistry of living systems, but also the hidden mechanical choreography that lays the groundwork for all biological possibility. Finally, there is an ethical echo that returns to the human ear. The same geological machinery that enables life also sets limits on how fast and how far change can be absorbed. The knowledge that volcanoes, plates, and oceans are the system's controllers should counsel humility. Whether or not an external observer exists, Earth's geological foundation remains the true caretaker of deep time. If humans are to act as stewards rather than disruptors, they must learn to work within the rhythms of that foundation, to respect gradients, to recognize thresholds, and to act with an awareness that the laboratory in which they live is simultaneously bountiful and brittle. In that lesson lies a principle both pragmatic and profound. To understand the laboratory is to accept the responsibility of tending it. What if every ice age and every greenhouse felt like a typed command in a program running on a planetary server, each keystroke? Not random, but an instruction, a probe. What if glacial advances and paroxysms of warmth were not only consequences of physics, but readable signals, parameters nudged, an experiment queried, a system tested? That provocative image anchors the next layer of inquiry. It forces attention on change itself, on volatility as method, on climate as a set of adjustable variables through which any observer, curious or cruel, could stage trials. Climate, in this framing, is the experimenter's interface. It is not a single dial but a panel of many. Insolation, greenhouse gas concentration, ice extent, ocean circulation strength, albedo, vegetation cover, atmospheric composition, and the timing of perturbations. Each element is both cause and effect, an instrument and a measurement. The great glaciations and the greenhouse epochs read in the sediments are then long-form commands. They are tests of endurance, flip of the ice toggle, test system stability, raise CO2, observe species responses, disrupt ocean circulation, measure carbon sequestration and biodiversity loss. The planet's response, sluggish, abrupt, sometimes catastrophic, becomes the output log. Consider the rhythm of ice ages. The Pleistocene is commonly described as a series of pulses, cycles paced by orbital variations known as Milankovitch cycles. Those changes in eccentricity, tilt, and precession alter where and how much sunlight reaches the surface. Seen through the laboratory lens, orbital forcing is a gentle programmer tapping keys, subtle shifts in input energy that ripple outward through gradients. Ice sheets form when summer melts fail to remove winter's accumulated snow. They grow, they reflect more sunlight. They cool the planet further, a feedback loop that amplifies the initial nudge. When ice retreats, the opposite cascade occurs. Each glacial advance is a stress test on ecosystems. Each retreat is a second test, one of rebound and migration. The biological consequences of glaciation are multifaceted. Species that contract climate by moving poleward or upslope survive, those anchored to narrow ecological niches perish. Populations fracture into refugia, isolated pockets where genetic drift and adaptation can yield new lineages. The fossil record shows that glacial cycles impose bottlenecks and open opportunities for radiation. From a data-gathering point of view, each ice age compresses evolutionary experiments into repeatable, comparable scenarios. The alternation between contraction and expansion is a way to probe resilience. How quickly can complex systems reconstitute themselves after major loss? How much diversity is necessary to rebuild ecological network function? How do food webs rewire in response to wholesale habitat shifts? Greenhouse periods answer complementary questions. The Paleocene-Eocene, thermal maximum, PETM, a relatively sudden spike in global temperatures some 56 million years ago, reads like an extreme raise CO2 command. The carbon pulse magnitude and rapidity still debated pushed surface waters to acidify and heated polar regions into temperate climates. The PETM tests chemical tolerance, reveals the limits of calcifying organisms, and accelerates migration across previously impassable climatic barriers. Where an ice age evaluates compressive stress, a greenhouse epoch probes expansionary capacity. How life responds to enriched energy flows, to the opening of new habitats, and to the stressors of increased acidity and hypoxia in the oceans. Between the glacial and the greenhouse lie abrupt, high-frequency anomalies, the Dansgaard, Oeschger events, Heinrich layers, the Younger Dryas, short, sharp edits to the planetary script. These are not slow toggles but sudden shocks. Currents slow, methane escapes, temperatures plunge or spike within decades. For an observer, they are the equivalent of randomized trials or stress injections, perturbations designed perhaps to reveal non-linearities. Do ecosystems collapse smoothly or in jumps? Are there hysteresis effects, states the system cannot easily return from? The paleoclimate record answers both yes and no. Responses vary by system, by region, by timescale. Coral reefs bleach and can collapse in years under thermal stress. Soil carbon pools can persist for millennia. The deep ocean takes centuries to equilibrate. Feedbacks are the experiment's internal software. Positive feedbacks amplify changes. Ice albedo feedback sends a cold planet further into freeze. Permafrost thaw releases methane and CO2, accelerating warming. Negative feedbacks restore balance. Increased plant growth under higher CO2 draws down some atmospheric carbon. Carbonate compensation in the ocean stores carbon in sediments. A thoughtful observer uses feedbacks as diagnostics, which are fast, which delayed, which strong, which feeble. The presence of bifurcations, tipping points beyond which changes produce qualitatively different states, matters enormously. The glaciation cycles test whether the climate system navigates between multiple basins of attraction or whether it crosses thresholds into new equilibria. The experimental metaphor gains texture when the control commands and perturbations are examined as potential interventions rather than mere chance events. Volcanic eruptions, for instance, are natural injections of aerosols and greenhouse gases. On short time scales, sulfate aerosols dim sunlight and cool the surface, an analog in modern rhetoric to deliberate geoengineering. On longer horizons, the outgassing of CO2 can persist, nudging the mean state. Large igneous provinces, massive flood basalts, have coincided with some of the most severe extinction events. In the narrative of tests, such eruptions are powerful, broad-spectrum probes. How resilient is global biotic complexity when photosynthesis falters or when ocean chemistry is altered wholesale? Ocean circulation acts as the planet's internal thermostat and memory. The Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, a conveyor of warmth, is sensitive to salinity and temperature. If it stalls, regional climates shift, oxygen distribution in the deep sea changes, nutrient upwelling alters primary productivity. In the lab metaphor, shutting down a pump and watching how the reactor re-equilibrates produces data about coupling strength. Sudden freshwater influxes from ice melt are real-world test inputs. The paleocord shows that abrupt workings of these pumps can drive rapid climate shifts, and the resulting biotic upheavals are written in the isotopic compositions and sedimentary anomalies that scientists read today. The sediments are the experimenter's logbook. Ice cores preserve atmospheric gases and aerosols trapped in bubbles. Tree rings register seasonal swings. Marine carbonates lock away isotopic signals that betray temperature and productivity. These archives are imperfect but invaluable. They record not only the mean states but also the transients, the spikes, the flickers that reveal the system's dynamic character. To interpret them requires sophisticated inference, rates of change, phase lags, regional heterogeneity. The presence of abrupt excursions in these logs suggests that the planetary system sometimes behaves as if poked by external agency, because, in a sense, it always has been poked by impacts, by volcanism, by orbital mechanics. There is an emotional choreography to reading these logs. A sense of wonder emerges at the sheer improvisational capacity of life, its capacity to reinvent around new constraints. Yet dread is never far behind. The same records show mass extinctions, ecosystem collapses, and loss. That interplay feeds ethical reflection. If each climatic fluctuation is a test, then making oneself the test subject steward becomes a moral question of high urgency. Do humans respond as responsible caretakers, stabilizing destructive trends and preserving the conditions for future diversification? Or do they accelerate perturbations, adding anthropogenic commands, industrial CO2 emissions, land use changes, aerosol burdens to a script already rich in variability? The current geological moment is striking because it layers a novel class of commands atop the natural variability of deep time. Rapid increases in greenhouse gases across decades and centuries are unprecedented in their pace, if not in magnitude. The experiment, if experiment is the right word, now includes a human hand with both the capacity to alter boundary conditions and the limited horizon of political cycles. The paleo record provides analogs and warnings. Abrupt warming reorganizes ecosystems, sea level rise redraws shorelines, ocean acidification constrains calcifying organisms, and permafrost thaw releases feedbacks that extend the perturbation. In this light, modern anthropogenic forcing is both a test and an ethical indictment. Humanity has become a modulator on the planetary console, for better or worse. The possibility that an external observer might have once toggled parameters in deep time complicates interpretation. Distinguishing between natural stochasticity and deliberate interventions would be difficult. Geological processes erase signatures. An experiment run millions of years ago could leave only faint isotopic whispers, chemical anomalies that are ambiguous between biological and geological causation. Even if an agent with technology beyond human imagination intervened, the traces would be subtle, smeared by tectonic recycling and diagenesis. For inquirers constrained to the planet's own memory, every perturbation becomes a riddle. Was this an accidental cascade, an emergent property of an energetic system, or directed command? That uncertainty fuels a particular kind of humility. It suggests that the interpretation of climatic shifts must be probabilistic and cautious. It also reframes the purpose of paleoclimate science not only as reconstruction, but as ethical orientation, to chart how systems respond to perturbations, to delineate thresholds where management is only possible at great cost, and to identify the interventions most likely to preserve habitability. If form of fluctuations are indeed commands in a cosmic script, then learning the grammar of those commands is a survival skill. There is a stylistic element to the way climate acts as a variable set, its temporal heterogeneity. Some tests play out over tens of thousands to millions of years, others over decades. The system's memory is stratified. Fast variables, atmospheric temperature, surface water chemistry, respond quickly. Slow variables, ice sheet volume, deep ocean carbon storage, continental uplift, integrate changes over much longer spans. The interplay of fast and slow variables produces path dependence. A rapid pulse of greenhouse gases may push fast systems to new states, even if slow systems are not yet adjusted. Conversely, long-term tectonics can set baselines that make certain transitions more likely. Recognizing this layered memory is crucial for any interpreter who hopes to distinguish between an experiment's immediate results and its long-term consequences. The image of climate as a testing platform also reframes extinction and recovery. Mass die-offs are not merely losses. In a statistical sense, they are resets that reconfigure ecological landscapes. The aftermath of extinction can be a period of evolutionary experimentation, vacant niches, altered interactions, and novel ecological architectures. Yet the tempo and character of recovery depend on the severity and the specificity of the perturbation. Some species and functions re-emerge quickly, others are gone for millions of years. For a patient observer, extinctions and recoveries provide comparative data about which functions are resilient, which architectures are repeatable, and which outcomes are path unique. Finally, the climate as variable picture carries a civic lesson. If Earth's past is a sequence of tests, then contemporary societies face a twofold responsibility. First, to read the signals in the sedimentary logbook with rigor and to translate that knowledge into policies that reduce risk and preserve adaptive potential. Second, to recognize that human activity has added a new class of commands to the system, commands that might be reckless if not informed by deep time perspective. Stewardship, in this sense, is the ethical response a species might adopt if it were to assume responsibility for a bench it did not build, but now manipulates. Thus, each glacial advance, each greenhouse interval, each abrupt excursion reads like a line of code in a planetary program. Whether typed by blind physics, by biological agency, or by an external observer, these commands have produced a history of tests and responses that shaped life's architecture. The task for humanity and for any intelligence that seeks to understand is to become fluent in that code. To do so is to move beyond mere curiosity and toward custodianship, to learn the grammar of change, to respect the timescales of the slow variables, to limit perturbations that produce irreversible transitions, and to preserve the rich experimental diversity that makes further discovery possible. In the long ledger of Earth's experiments, humility and care may be the only truly reliable responses. What if the first experiments on this planetary bench were not grand gestures but quiet, microscopic auditions? What if the earliest observations began not with cities or monuments, but with the whispered work of bacteria and algae, with single-celled actors testing the rough chemistry of shallow seas and hydrothermal margins? That question reframes the origin story. The experiment did not open with spectacle, but with repetition, with tiny organisms cycling through success and failure until certain strategies stuck. In that light, the earliest biosphere reads like a library of trials where the specimens were microbes and proto-eukaryotes, and the data were written in mats of filaments, in faint shifts of isotopes, and in the slow accretion of stromatolites. The first cohort on this stage was simple by design yet astonishing in consequence. Bacteria, archaea, and primitive algae occupied the experimental niches that geology had prepared: mineral-rich vent fields, sunlit tidal flats, ephemeral ponds that dried and re-wetted, and the chemically stratified layers of nascent oceans. Each niche presented a particular set of gradients: redox potential, pH, temperature, salinity, and each gradient functioned as a test parameter. Microbes were natural experimenters. Their metabolisms probed chemistry at interfaces where non-living systems could not easily maintain order. Chemolithotrophs harvested energy from iron, sulfur, or hydrogen. Photosynthetic microbes learned to harness photons and slough off waste gases that would later reorganize planetary chemistry. The laboratory here was small in scale and immense in consequence. The observer, if there were one, would have watched the earliest phase with a patient, almost surgical interest. The useful experiments were repeatable. Colonization of a hydrothermal mound by sulfur-oxidizing bacteria, for example, showed that where a steady flux of reduced compounds met oxidants, metabolic pathways could stabilize and proliferate. Such stability was a success note on the experimental ledger, a microbial community that endured, altered its microenvironment, and left a signature in mineral precipitation. In environments where concentrations and cycles favored polymer formation, primitive catalytic systems could persist long enough to explore complexity. In other places, a single perturbation, a salinity spike, a chemical poison, a drop in temperature collapsed nascent systems into extinction. Those failures, too, were informative. They revealed thresholds and susceptibilities. There is a kind of austere poetry in how early life turned failures into data. When a microbial mat died back under a sudden change in chemistry, its decay products altered sediments and created microenvironments for new colonists. A failed metabolic strategy left chemical legacies and bound carbon in isotopic fractionations trapped in carbonate, or in the rusting of iron into banded iron formations. Over eons, these signatures accumulated into a partially legible archive. In that archive, both success and failure were preserved, an observer's dataset encoded in the strata. In a way that is both cold and generous, the planet recorded everything it could about what worked and what did not. The earliest visible archives were stromatolites, layered structures built by microbial communities in shallow waters. These benthic carpets were more than fossils, they were living notebooks. Each lamina was a page, a thin record of bacterial productivity, of trapping and binding of sediment, of alternating conditions of light and turbidity. Across millions of years, stromatolites documented rhythms of growth and decline, the paleoclimatic soot that dimmed light, and even the geochemical pivot points when certain metabolisms rose to dominance. To the patient observer, stromatolites were a classroom, demonstrating ecological engineering at the smallest scale, organisms that modified their niche, setting the stage for new metabolic possibilities. Photosynthesis itself reads like a pivotal experiment. The earliest light-harvesting microbes probably used amoxygenic pathways, tapping sulfide or iron as electron donors. These systems mattered because they revealed a principle. Life could exploit endlessly available fluxes, photons, and transduce them into chemical gradients. When oxygenic photosynthesis emerged, perhaps carried by the ancestors of cyanobacteria, the implications were planetary. Oxygen was a waste product for those cells, but it was also a transformative reagent, reactive, life-changing, and difficult for many existing metabolisms to tolerate. The rise of oxygen in the atmosphere, the great oxidation event, is a paradigmatic moment in which a successful microbial strategy cascaded into a system-wide boundary shift. It was an experimental outcome with unintended consequences: success for oxygenic microbes, catastrophe for strict anaerobes, and a reconfiguration of redox gradients across the globe. The dynamics of early ecosystems were therefore not static. They were adaptive scripts of mutation, lateral gene exchange, and selection. Microbes exchanged genes across domains, forging new metabolic modules that could be plugged into different cellular architectures. Genetic novelty was a cheap experiment, a plasmid here, a horizontal transfer there, and suddenly a community could try a new metabolic program. For observers seeking to map strategies, these episodes were rich data, which metabolic innovation spread, which remained localized. And how did environmental context determine the fitness of a new pathway? Over geological time, successful modules propagated in the form of expanded ecological niches and altered biogeochemistry. The observer's notebook would register patterns beyond single metabolisms. There were ecological architectures, the layered microbial mats, the chemosynthetic towers at vents, planktonic blooms in nutrient-rich upwelling zones that recurred where boundary conditions were similar. Each recurrence was a data point showing convergence, similar solutions arising in similar circumstances. The repetition suggested a generality to life's experimentation, a confirmation that certain classes of problems, how to harvest energy from a sulfide flux, how to concentrate organics in a drying pool, had robust biological answers. That lesson would be crucial if the observer sought to generalize, to predict which worlds, given certain chemistry and energy flows, would reliably produce life-like complexity. Yet the dataset also included outliers and anomalous experiments. Microbial-like communities at times produced biogenic structures that fossilized in peculiar ways, or created isotopic signatures difficult to reconcile with purely abiotic chemistry. Those anomalies were the tantalizing hints that something new had been tried, perhaps a metabolic pathway that left a trace. Unlike anything before, observers with an interpretive framework might flag such anomalies as prime evidence of emergent complexity or of interventions for local inhabitants of the planet, later organisms, and, much later, sentient humans. These anomalies would become mysteries to puzzle over, the fingerprints of deep-time experiments left to be read and misread. From an ethical distance, the microbial era raises odd questions about property and consent. Microbes do not volunteer and cannot consent, yet they were experimental subjects that reshaped their environment. If someone deliberate had been setting parameters, those early organisms were both data and engineers, agents and outcomes. Whether one reads the record teleologically or as emergent consequence, it is difficult not to be moved by the sacrificial nature of adaptation. The spread of oxygen is an emblematic story, a metabolic triumph for some, an extinction event for others. In the ledger of experiments, success and harm were inseparable. Evolutionary novelty often came at the cost of other forms of life. The paleobiological record translates microbial processes into durable traces. Isotopic fractionation in carbon and sulfur becomes a barcode of metabolic types. Mineral precipitates capture episodes of intense biological mediation. Organic biomarkers, though modified by diagenesis, signal the presence of particular biochemical pathways. For any observer scanning the strata, the microbial era is a dense folio, rich in both signal and noise. Interpreting that record demands an understanding of how biology scopes matter at the microscale and how geology tends to blur or erase those patterns. Successes appear as widespread chemical shifts or as stratigraphic abundances. Failures appear as abrupt disappearances, truncated phylogenies, or the replacement of one functional guild by another. One of the subtler lessons from this early phase is how cumulative experimentation builds complexity. Small, localized advantages, a better light-harvesting pigment, a more efficient membrane pump can ripple outward when they enable organisms to alter local chemistry in a way that favors further novelty. The oxygenation cascade was just such an amplifying chain. Similarly, when microbial communities began cycling nutrients more efficiently, they created ecological scaffolding that later multicellular organisms would exploit. The observer could extract a principle: complexity is not a single leap, but an accretion of successful micro-experiments that alter boundary conditions to make further experiments viable. There's another layer of data in the way failures themselves structure possibility. When a metabolic strategy collapses under environmental stress, it often leaves vacant niches and altered chemical landscapes. Those vacuums facilitate diversification. The observer who paid attention to failure would recognize its generative potential. Extinction is not only an end, but also a reset knob that reveals the toyed with parameter space anew. In that sense, the lab's worst failures were also its most instructive runs. They revealed system limits, exposed hidden couplings, and produced a different kind of information about resilience and recovery. Human observers, in whatever imagined distant future or alien labs, would struggle with the interpretive problem posed by early microbial life. Microbial signatures are both abundant and easy to misclassify. Abiotic processes can mimic biological fractionations. Diagenesis can obscure lipid biomarkers. Tectonics can shuffle or erase layers. Hence, the question of detection becomes central. The record of the first biosphere is partial and noisy by necessity, preserved in fragments that require inference, modeling, and imagination to reconstruct. Yet within those fragments lies a coherent narrative. Life began as small tests. Some strategies propagated, others failed, and the aggregate of those trials transformed the planet's chemistry and its capacity for further novelty. For humans listening to this story, the emotional cadence is complex. There is wonder at the elegant sufficiency of tiny organisms to remold a world. There is humility in recognizing that the grand arcs of planetary history are often determined by microscopic experiments. There is also a cautionary note. If the first successful strategies on Earth produced global oxygenation with catastrophic consequences for other lineages, then success can be both liberating and catastrophic depending on the frame. The microbial era is thus a parable about unintended consequences. Small innovations can have planetary impacts, and those impacts cascade in ways that are profoundly difficult to anticipate. If Earth was once a testing ground, then the first test subjects taught the most important lesson, that life is an experimental process, iterative and opportunistic. Every metabolic novelty, every mat and bloom, every marginal success contributed to a gradually accumulating dataset that reshaped boundary conditions for the next generation of experiments. The planet's early biosphere was the laboratory's initial sample set, rough, noisy, and indispensable. Successes became templates to be scaled. Failures became contrastive controls that illuminated system fragilities. To study that era is to read a ledger of tiny choices and massive consequences. Finally, there is an ethical echo that travels from those microbial mats to the present, the recognition that the capacity to alter planetary conditions, once rare and emergent, is no longer exclusive to microbes. A species that contemplates its own history must also confront the responsibility that comes with altering the environment at scale. If microscopic experiments reshape the world, then large-scale technological experiments reshape it now. The lesson from the first samples is, therefore, both observational and prescriptive. Understand the incremental nature of change. Respect the complex feedbacks that amplify small effects into planetary outcomes, and treat the laboratory of Earth with a humility born of the knowledge that some of the earliest experiments were made by organisms without foresight, and their consequences became the scaffolding of everything that followed. What if the first thing that settles on a mind confronted with the hypothesis of Earth as experiment is not an answer, but a feeling? A two-sided current of beauty and unease that pulls like tides. That image is the animating question of this section. When the planet is read as a testing ground, what rhythm forms between aesthetic admiration and existential anxiety? And how does that rhythm shape the ways humans look, think, and act? On one level, the response is immediate and almost neurological. Natural scenes arrange themselves into compositions that the human brain recognizes as pleasing. Horizon lines that cut across gradients of light, ridge lines that echo the mathematic of fractals, the play of color on a reef like a deliberate palette. Those patterns are not arbitrary. They are the visible signatures of gradients and constraints, energy flows, chemical differentials, physical limits, and they map onto perceptual systems honed by evolution to prefer certain kinds of information. Beauty, in this sense, is the brain's shorthand for complexity that is coherent, legible, and useful. A coastline is attractive because its geometry signals resources. A forest seems lush because its structure promises shelter and calories. But when that same coastline, that same forest, is imagined as part of an experimental setup, aesthetic pleasure acquires an additional valence. It becomes evidence. The eye that delights recognizes not only form but also function, and that recognition can be both consoling and disquieting. The aesthetic rhythm of a planet in deep time can be conceived like a long, slow symphony. The first movement is geological, a basso continuo of mantle convection and tectonic thrusts that establishes the tonal center. Mountains rise and fall as sustained chords. Continents drift like leitmotifs migrating across the orchestral score. The second movement is climatic, with its pulses and reversals, glaciations and warmings that enter and exit like percussion accents, marking time on a scale that confounds human patience. The third movement is biological, improvisatory, yet tethered to the score. Microbial motifs evolve into multicellular counterpoints. Ecosystems weave polyphonies of interaction, and cognition eventually produces an emergent theme that can reflect on the entire composition. For those tuned to it, the music of Earth is astonishingly beautiful, not harmonic in the naive sense, but intricate, layered and dynamically balanced. Yet this music also contains dissonance, catastrophic drops, sudden changes, the shriek of extinction. And that dissonance is what gives the piece its dramatic charge. That intensity, the co-presence of beauty and violence, elicits a peculiar human emotion. It is a compound feeling that slips between awe and vertigo. Awe opens the chest, vertigo empties it. In one instant, a person can feel grateful, humbled, reverent. In the next, they can feel small, manipulated, and exposed. The same vista that inspires a poem can, under the laboratory hypothesis, be read as a specimen under a slide, a composition curated for a remote observer's interest. The effect resembles the philosophical sublime, something so vast and powerful that it both elevates and destabilizes the human faculties for comprehension. The sublime here is twofold: an aesthetic register that celebrates grandeur, and an ethical one that questions agency and authorship. The emotional cadence is not uniform across cultures or individuals, but certain motifs recur. Religious systems often encode a response to the sensation of being watched, ritual observances, taboos, and moral codes reflecting the idea of an overseeing intelligence. Those cultural forms can be read as social technologies for coping with the anxiety of observation. Artistic traditions, meanwhile, tend to translate the tension into objects and performances that make the disquiet legible. Murals that depict the sky as a watchful eye, songs that dramatize the fragility of human life in the face of cosmic forces, architecture that seeks to mimic natural rhythm in columns and vaults. Science has its own aesthetic responses. Practitioners talk about elegance and simplicity, about the beauty of a model that compresses many observations into a single framework. In melancholy symmetry, the same aesthetic appreciation that draws scientists to patterns also makes them acutely aware of the stakes. Understanding the interlocking dynamics of climate and life often involves confronting evidence of past collapses and of futures that could be engineered for good or ill. The laboratory image reconfigures how beauty is experienced. Consider a coral reef, typically admired for its riotous color and apparent abundance. Seen as an experimental plot, a reef is a set of parameters: pH, temperature, nutrient load, light penetration, arranged in a sensitive balance that supports a high diversity of forms. Its aesthetic becomes instructive. The fragility that makes it precious also makes it revealing. Small perturbations produce large, non-linear responses. This double reading produces a new kind of sorrow, the recognition that the object of love is also a meter for system health. That sorrow is not merely sentimental. It becomes a practical emotion that can motivate preservation research and a politics of protection. In that way, aesthetic assessment can slide into ethical imperative. There is another, subtler rhythm at work: the interplay between immediacy and deep time. Human aesthetic sensibilities are tuned to human timescales. A sunset lasts minutes, a glacier retreats over decades. When the deep time canvas is foregrounded, perceptual preferences are forced to stretch. The pulse of attachment lengthens. What begins as a visceral reaction to a single view becomes a patient, almost ritualized attention to layers, to tree rings as diaries of drought, to ice cores as pages in a global ledger, to sedimentary sequences as a slow palimpsest of environmental moods. That patient attention cultivates a deliberative aesthetic, an appreciation not only for what is seen in an instant, but for the narrative accumulated across ages. It is a different kind of beauty, one that rewards reading rather than staring. But the aesthetic emotional rhythm also has political effects. When a population feels simultaneously small and observed, two divergent impulses can arise. One is humility and care, an ethic of stewardship, an inclination to lessen harms and to conserve the conditions that allow future curiosity. The other is resentment and defiance, a desire to assert autonomy, to shake off a perceived surveillance. These impulses feed into policy and practice. Conservation movements often deploy aesthetic rhetoric: loss of beauty, as a loss of self, to mobilize resources. Populist reactions sometimes couch resistance in terms of rejecting external control, whether that control is real or imagined. The psychological architecture of being watched, whether by gods, neighbors, or hypothetical extraterrestrial curators, thus plays into governance, ritual, and conflict. It affects how societies allocate attention and capital, whether to invest in archives and museums, in mitigation campaigns, or in projects that declare independence from planetary constraints. Art and science, in the face of this duality, become complementary strategies of orientation. Artists translate the terror into metaphor and the beauty into form. Scientists translate the pattern into models and the fear into quantification. Both are aesthetic acts. The paleoclimatologist who runs a spectral analysis of cores experiences a kind of delight akin to the painter who finds a new way to mix pigments. Both gestures are acts of translation. They turn baffling scale into legible expression. The cultural role that emerges from this convergence is a custodial narrative, an account that binds beauty to responsibility, suggesting that appreciation obliges preservation. There is also an economic and consumptive rhythm to how beauty is treated. Landscapes prized for their aesthetics can become commodities, destinations for tourism, sources of extractive profit, or backdrops for branding. This commodification introduces a counter-rhythm of exploitation and conservation. The very attention that confers value can erode that value. Tourist footpaths trample fragile mosses. Development transforms vistas into subdivisions. The laboratory analogy sharpens moral clarity. If the planet is a testbed whose traces matter for future interpretation, then the careless conversion of beauty into commodity is equivalent to scalpel bluntness in a delicate assay. The aesthetic impulse to collect and display must be tempered by an ethic of minimal interference, a curator's restraint. Embedded in the aesthetic thread is the haunting question the hypothesis provokes. Are humans the final product of an experiment, or merely one iteration among many? The feeling this question produces is ambivalent. Pride and hubris can swell when the human capacity for culture, abstraction, and technology is read as culmination. That pride, however, sits uneasily beside doubt. If a being outside the system judged its outcomes, might humans be found neither elegant nor efficient? The oscillation between self-congratulation and self-skepticism generates a social rhythm, cycles of anthropocentric triumphalism followed by periods of existential humility. Those cycles are visible in intellectual history. Eras to proclaim human mastery interposed with those that highlight planetary constraints and human contingency. The laboratory hypothesis intensifies that alternation because it offers an external frame against which human accomplishments can be measured. The emotional register in response to the final product question shades into moral reasoning. If humans are a designed endpoint, some might infer special protection or favor from the designer, a cosmic underwrite of human value. If humans are mere byproducts, others might interpret the same as license for indifference or as liberation from teleology. Documentary thinking resists both extremes by returning to consequences. Whether or not humans are the intended outcome, their actions now have planetary effects. The ethical significance is not settled by origin stories. It is decided by behavior. This pivot from metaphysical debate to practical ethics is a characteristic move of the documentary. Narrator, it acknowledges the seduction of speculation but insists that choices in the present are the true locus of judgment. The aesthetic and emotional rhythms have another, less visible but equally powerful dimension, the tempo of attention. Human societies have a limited bandwidth of focused care. Beauty and dread compete for that attention. Iconic landscapes can monopolize concern while sprawling, less photogenic biomes rot unnoticed. Spectacular disasters capture headlines, but slow-motion losses, soil degradation, aquifer depletion, biodiversity erosion fall beneath the perceptual threshold. The laboratory metaphor suggests a triage. Some experiments are dramatic and attract observers. Others are subtle and require painstaking methods to detect. Forming habits of long attention, archives, monitoring programs, cultural rituals that institutionalize care becomes a civic technology for correcting the biases of aesthetic immediacy. The emotional architecture also includes resilience narratives. Communities confronted with the thought of being specimens often generate stories of agency that even if they are observed, they can act with dignity. Even if they are samples, they can act responsibly. Artworks, rituals, and scientific projects become forms of reply. Museums curate not merely artifacts but responses, Public art can memorialize lost ecologies and inspire stewardship, citizen. Science programs convert aesthetic appreciation into data collection. In these practices, admiration is transmuted into participation. The aesthetic rhythm drives engagement rather than paralysis. Beauty becomes a lever for collective action. Yet there is also a grieving rhythm that runs through many responses. Recognition of planetary fragility can give rise to melancholic aesthetics, elegies for disappearing species, mourning rituals for eroded shorelines, memorials to vanished glaciers. Grief here is not merely personal, it is epistemic, a lament for the loss of future possibility. For an ethic attuned to deep time, grief has a pedagogical role. It recalibrates appetite and urges restraint. Museums of loss, curated repositories of extinct species or depleted habitats, perform a civic mourning that doubles as a warning. If the laboratory is to remain useful to later interpreters, the archives must be kept. Finally, the rhythm between aesthetic admiration and emotional unease bends toward a practical summons. Whether or not an external observer exists, the argument of this documentary voice is that humans stand before a system both breathtaking and precarious, and that the right response is not resignation nor panicked hubris, but a mode of attention steeped in humility. To watch the planet as if it were a specimen is to learn caution. To watch it as if it were a work of art is to experience care. Between these poles lies stewardship as a practical ethic, to archive, to minimize harm, to experiment with restraint, and to cultivate cultural forms that bind beauty to responsibility. The cadence closes with an image less of finality than of ongoing motion. The world's aesthetic pulse, the ebb of tides, the slow folding of rock, the bloom and fade of coral colors continues regardless of human verdict. Yet humans are not merely spectators, they are participants in the orchestra, capable of introducing new motifs, of muting existing ones, or of striking wrong notes that cannot be recovered within acceptable spans of time. The experiment continues. The emotional and aesthetic rhythms it provokes need not end in paralysis. They can become a pedagogy, an education in scale, an apprenticeship in care, a practice of listening to the long music of a planet whose beauty is inseparable from its vulnerability. In that practice lies the most eloquent reply to the question that began this section, whether humans are the final product, a transient feature, or something else. They can choose how to comport themselves in this brief, beautiful, terrifying moment of attention. What if the planet's most violent moments were not anomalies at the margins of a calm story, but the very instruments by which a system is probed? What if eruptions, earthquakes and celestial impacts are the laboratory's high-voltage impulses, the stress tests that reveal where a world creaks, where it yields, and where something new might take root? That question reframes catastrophe as method, extreme, destructive, and yet instructive. It casts sudden geological violence not merely a spectacle, but as an interrogation of resilience, a set of shocks designed, or behaving exactly like probes that push a complex system to its limits. The language of stress tests is clinical and precise. Engineers run them to determine failure modes. Clinicians administer them to reveal underlying vulnerabilities. In deep time, volcanic supereruptions, planetary-scale quakes, and asteroid strikes play the same role at planetary scale. Their signatures are abrupt excursions in the archives, a global layer of iridium, ash-plastered horizons, a sudden disappearance of diverse taxa, a spike in isotopic ratios. Each shock forces the Earth into a state of disequilibrium and watches the system's response, collapse, reorganization, or the surprising emergence of novel structures. Viewed through that lens, the planet's history reads as a series of challenges and answers, a long data set of perturbations and recoveries. Volcanism, in particular, is both a slow burn and a sudden jolt. At times it is the steady background of outgassing that sets atmospheric composition across eons. At others, it is the cataclysmic pulse of flood, basalts, and supereruptions that belch enough gas and ash into the skies to change climates within seasons. The Siberian traps, the Deccan flows. In the narrative of extinction, they look like deliberate resets. Ash clouds that encircle the globe dim sunlight, silence photosynthesis, cool the surface. Sulfate aerosols alter atmospheric chemistry. Torrents of carbon dioxide then return, ushering in greenhouse phases. For life, the consequence is a dramatic stress test. Organisms must withstand abrupt decreases in primary productivity, shifts in oxygen chemistry, and corrosive changes in ocean acidity. Those capable of enduring are testaments to resilience. Those that fail mark the boundaries of tolerable perturbation. Earthquakes and tectonic upheavals are another class of shock. more spatially selective but no less profound in their capacity to rewire ecology. Fault ruptures, reconfigure drainage basins overnight, isolate populations behind new ranges, create fresh littoral shelves, or bury ancient habitats under ruptured crust. The immediate violence, landslides, tsunamis, local fires, is the most visible effect. Less visible, but arguably more consequential, are the cascading changes in topography and hydrology that follow. Rivers divert, sedimentation patterns change, nutrient fluxes are interrupted or redirected. The ecological consequences of such structural change can unfold across centuries, shaping evolutionary trajectories by fragmenting gene pools and opening new adaptive arenas. In the experiment, earthquakes are spatial perturbations. They test the coupling between landscape and life, forcing ecosystems to reorganize around altered physical scaffolds. Meteor and cometary impacts are the supreme perturbations in the stress test repertoire. They are blunt, catastrophic, and global. When a sufficiently large body strikes, it is as if the bench is struck with a sledgehammer. Ejecta blankets the globe. Skies turn incandescent. Shock waves sterilize shallow seas, and long-term climatic effects impact winter, followed by greenhouse rebound, rewrite the rules for living systems. The Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary is the canonical example, an abrupt, worldwide layer of iridium and soot, the disappearance of non-avian dinosaurs, the rise of mammals into ecological space left vacant. An impact is an extreme proof test. Can complex, large-bodied organisms persist in the wake of a planet-scale disturbance? The answer, in that famous case, was no for some clades and yes for others. The impact thus functioned as both terminating event and opportunity, a brutal reset that opened a new phase of experimentation. In the ecological landscape, across these modes the commonality is suddenness. Systems are driven away from equilibria. Feedbacks scramble and latent couplings, chemical, physical, biological, are exposed. The value for an external observer is manifold. Abrupt shocks accelerate processes that would otherwise play out slowly, making hidden dependencies visible within human meaningful timescales. They reveal tipping points, thresholds at which small changes produce disproportionate systemic reconfiguration. They also show the architecture of recovery, what sequence of species replacements follows. How quickly does primary productivity rebound? Which metabolic strategies regain dominance and which are irrecoverably lost? In short, catastrophic events are the planet's accelerants for the study of resilience and contingency. There is a paradox buried in this idea. Catastrophe wipes pages of the archive even as it writes new ones. Volcanic ash buries city-sized forests. Tectonics consumes coastlines. Impacts vaporize coastal habitats. Geological processes both record and erase. The very shocks that are the richest data generators are often the ones that obliterate local contexts, making later interpretation puzzling. This is why the planet's history reads simultaneously as a vivid ledger of dramatic runs and as a fragmented, partial data set. The paleontologist, the sedimentologist, and the geochemist work with shards. The patterns they extract require inference, modeling, and a recognition that some chapters of Earth's story will forever be missing. Human response to the spectacle of planetary violence is a study in ambivalence. Awe and horror intermingle. Catastrophe produces striking narratives, images of cities consumed by lava, coastlines reshaped by quake and tsunami, skies blackened by impact dust. Those images provoke existential questions. Is such violence random, the blunt consequence of an indifferent cosmos? Or is it a feature of an experimental system deliberately toggled to test the limits of life? The first answer yields humility. The second, if taken further, hints at ethical imbalances, the possibility of being examined without consent. For many, the visceral reaction is less metaphysical than practical, a recognition of vulnerability that calls for preparation, mitigation, and the preservation of knowledge. The emotional arc is thus both contemplative and activist, grief for losses and resolve to reduce avoidable harms and to build resilience. Resilience itself is not a simple property. The stress test metaphor clarifies why resilience is multidimensional. There is structural resilience, the capacity of a system to maintain organization in the face of perturbation. There is functional resilience, the ability for ecosystem processes like nutrient cycling and primary productivity to persist. And there is evolutionary resilience, the capacity for lineages to adapt or for new lineages to arise. A volcanic winter might decimate large-bodied fauna, while microbes and small-bodied generalists persist. An impact may sterilize surface habitats, but leave deep-sea chemosynthetic communities intact. A tectonic uplift can fragment populations and, over millennia, generate bursts of speciation. Each shock leaves a selective fingerprint, privileging some forms, punishing others, and shaping the palette from which future novelty can be painted. The laboratory metaphor also invites consideration of scale and frequency. Not all shocks are equally informative. A perturbation that is so extreme it permanently removes the capacity for complex life is a failed trial from the perspective of an observer interested in longevity. An ideal stress test, if one assumes design, would be severe enough to probe limits yet bounded enough to allow recovery, to make visible what matters but not to destroy the bench. Nature's own record shows many such bounded trials, mass extinctions that, while devastating, do not sterilize the planet. The recurrence of such events implies that the global system is robust in certain respects. Life tends to re-emerge, ecosystems reorganize, and new functional configurations arise. Whether that robustness is a feature selected by blind physical laws or an affordance exploited by any hypothetical curator depends on philosophical taste, but in practical terms, it is the persistent feature that makes ongoing experimentation possible. There is a scientific urgency to understanding these extreme events because of the difficulty of separating natural rhythms from possible external interventions. Human beings face the paradox of agency. Their own technological capacities now produce rapid, global perturbations that in magnitude rival or exceed some natural shocks. Anthropogenic emissions, large-scale deforestation, and engineered climate interventions are novel commands on the planetary console. The paleo record of ancient shocks, therefore, becomes an analog dataset, what can be learned about system sensitivity. Feedbacks and thresholds from past catastrophes that can inform present choices. If extreme volcanism led to prolonged ocean anoxia in one past episode, what does that say about the risks of rapid CO2 increase today? If impacts have historically opened ecological space, how might contemporary disturbances open or close different futures? The stress tests of deep time are thus not just curiosities, they are manuals for present stewardship and for the ethical design of interventions. Technological civilization now bears a unique responsibility illuminated by this perspective. In earlier eras, shocks were primarily exogenous, driven by orbital mechanics, internal geodynamics, and stray interplanetary bodies. Today, humanity is an agent that can mimic, exacerbate, or mitigate such shocks. That is a precarious privilege. The knowledge that abrupt environmental change can cascade into irreversible thresholds means that decisions about planetary scale manipulation must be guided by humility and deep historical understanding. To attempt to experiment on a global scale without full appreciation of coupling and lag effects is to risk collapsing the very architecture that allows for ongoing adaptation. Here, the documentary voice becomes prescriptive. The history of shocks counsels restraint. Yet there is another facet to consider: opportunity. Resets do not only mean ruin, they can, and often do, clear ecological spaces for the rise of new forms. Extinctions are followed by radiations. The gaps left by collapses are places where novelty can be tested, where evolutionary improvisation tries combinations that might otherwise be precluded by competition. From that point of view, shocks are both destructive and creative, the cruel midwives of innovation. This ambivalence complicates any simplistic moralization of catastrophic events. If an observer's aim were to study emergent novelty, then intermittent, strong perturbations might be the most efficient strategy for revealing what architectures of life are possible under diverse constraints. Detecting the fingerprints of ancient shocks and interpreting their role in shaping subsequent evolution is a forensic science. Layered ash horizons, shifts in isotopic ratios, abrupt changes in fossil assemblages, and global geochemical excursions are clues. But the interpretation is layered with uncertainty. Diagenesis alters signals. Plate tectonics buries and recycles records. Some mass die-offs leave subtle signatures that are difficult to distinguish from gradual change. The question of intent, whether shocks are natural noise or deliberate probes, is therefore almost impossible to resolve from the strata alone. This epistemic humility is a recurring theme. The planet's archives are rich and maddeningly ambiguous, offering strong suggestions without decisive testimony. For cultures that have long lived in environments shaped by sudden geological violence, the memory of shocks becomes part of the social fabric. Myth, ritual, and architectural practice encode lessons about where not to build, when to flee, how to store seed, and how to manage burned soils. Those practices are cultural stress test responses. They are adaptations not to gradual change, but to episodic catastrophe. In that way, human societies are themselves experiments in resilience strategies. Which governance structures survive repeated shocks? Which social networks redistribute risk and enable recovery? Anthropologists and historians read human experiment alongside geological experiment, recognizing that survival through deep time requires both ecological and social robustness. The stress test perspective reframed conservation as well. Protecting diversity is not merely about cherishing the beautiful, it is an insurance strategy. Genetic diversity is the raw material for future adaptation. Ecological redundancy provides buffers when components fail. When a shock clears a stage, the presence of diverse, spatially distributed lineages determines how effectively functions, like nutrient cycling or primary productivity, can reestablish. Thus, the preservation of variety is not sentimental but pragmatic. It is how a system ensures that future trials will have a broad palette from which to reassemble complexity. Finally, the metaphor of shocks as tests carries ethical implications for observers, real or hypothetical. If a sentient intelligence were deliberately injecting perturbations to study systemic behavior, then the question of responsibility arises in a stark form. What duty does an experimenter owe to its subjects? If those subjects are ecosystems, communities, and sentient beings, does curiosity justify the infliction of harm? The moral calculus, familiar in terrestrial bioethics, scales badly to planetary proportions. For humans, who now possess the capacity to trigger their own shocks, the lesson is inescapable. The power to probe must be matched by a duty of care. Whether the planet's past shocks were natural or designed, the present shall be judged by how humanity handles its experimental agency. So when the Earth is struck, by lava, by fault, by sky, it is not simply damaged, it is interrogated. The system's response reveals hidden architecture, tests resilience, and alters the phase space of future possibilities. The shocks are simultaneous erasers and revealers. They clear local histories even as they expose systemic patterns. They force a practical humility on any intelligence that reads the record. That understanding demands both reverence for the violence that shapes life and a commitment to stewardship that prevents unnecessary, avoidable catastrophes. Whether such upheavals are merely transitional steps in a planetary program or the raw, uncoordinated language of geophysics and celestial mechanics, they remain the most vivid demonstrations of the planet's capacity to surprise, to destroy, and to renew. In the end, catastrophe is not merely an end, it is a punctuation mark in a sentence that continues. Each shock forces a reset, sometimes partial, sometimes profound, and the story goes on. If the planet is a testing ground, then its most extreme trials illuminate the grammar of resilience. They show what can break and what can be rebuilt. They reveal the thresholds beyond which recovery is costly or impossible. They create the openings where novelty enters. For those who would listen, the lesson is twofold: to study the past's violent tests with rigor and modesty, and to approach the power to make new tests with the restraint that comes from understanding what is truly at stake. The planet's shocks may be transitions, but they are transitions that demand guardians who can read the ledger and act with wisdom. What does a trial by fire actually measure? What does endurance look like when the laboratory is a planet and the tests unfold on timescales that smear human lives into moments? If one accepts the conceit that Earth's history consists of deliberate or incidental probes, temperature ramps, acid pulses, oxygen gambits, impact winters, then the most compelling record is not merely what failed, but how the living world reorganized itself in the aftermath. Each perturbation leaves two legible tracks, a ledger of losses and a ledger of survivors. The interplay between those lists is the script by which complexity is both culled and recomposed. At every scale of life there is selection. Genes that confer thermal tolerance, shells that resist dissolution, metabolisms that cope with low oxygen. These are the molecular tickets to survival. At the organismal level, it is often the small, the mobile, and the generalist that persist. Creatures that reproduce quickly, disperse widely, or enter dormancy when conditions spike. At the ecological level, fragmented habitats create refugia pockets of relative stability where lineages can linger and from, which they may later expand. At the biogeochemical level, Microbes mutate or swap genes and rapidly reconfigure the chemistry of their environments. The pattern is clear. Endurance is not uniform. It is a mosaic of tactics, some evolutionary, some ecological, some utterly contingent. The mechanisms by which trials extinguish life are varied and interlocking. Heat alters enzymatic kinetics and protein stability. Beyond certain thresholds, physiological systems fail. Rapid warming increases metabolic rates, which in turn demands more oxygen and calories at the very moment that supply. Chains, planktonic productivity, plant photosynthesis, prey abundance may be collapsing. Ocean acidification dissolves the very budgets by which shell builders calcify. Corals, mollusks, and certain plankton encounter a chemical environment that erodes their skeletal scaffolding. Anoxia, oxygen-depleted seas, converts ocean basins into chemical deserts where aerobic life suffocates and where anaerobic. Microbes proliferate, producing hydrogen sulfide and other toxic feedbacks that amplify stress on survivors. These are not isolated failures, but cascading cascades. A volcanic pulse that injects sulfur into the atmosphere can dim sunlight for years, shutting down photosynthesis, causing surface ecosystems to crash and detrital food chains to become the primary sustenance for microbes. A flood basalt eruption that later pumps CO2 into the atmosphere reverses that cooling into a prolonged greenhouse, creating ocean stratification and reducing nutrient mixing. An impact can drive an initial heat spike, an optical blackout from soot and dust, followed by acid rains and prolonged perturbations to the carbon cycle. In each instance, the proximate killer, temperature, chemistry, light triggers, secondary effects, habitat compression, pathogen emergence, trophic disconnects, and loss of mutualistic relationships that many species rely upon. The laboratory's probes are rarely neat. They interweave and compound. When many lineages falter at once and whole modes of life vanish, the geological record registers a mass extinction. In the language of the metaphor, these are resets, dramatic, sometimes near sterilizing events that clear the ecological slate. Yet, reset is misleading if it suggests a return to a prior state. More accurately, mass extinctions are transitions that open new dimensions of possibility. The forms that follow are not copies of what preceded. They are novel configurations assembled from the survivor's raw material. Radiations that bloom in the wake of die-offs are not merely recovery. They are experiments in recombinatory assembly. Vacant niches invite opportunists. The demise of dominant competitors reduces selective pressures that had constrained diversity, allowing evolution to pursue previously inaccessible trajectories. Survivors are instructive. Their attributes teach what works under pressure. In many documented recoveries, smaller body size, broad diets, flexible life histories, and high dispersal capacity are common features. Microbial communities often act as the scaffolds of renewal, metabolically transforming environments and recreating gradients that support higher trophic structures. In some cases, formerly marginal metabolisms, chemosynthesis, anaerobic methane oxidation, become central to ecosystem function. From the vantage of an observer, the post-crisis world reads like a set of alternative solutions, varied assemblages that favor different trade-offs between efficiency, robustness, and exploratory potential. It is tempting to see mass extinctions as merely destructive, but there is a darker, more subtle economy at play. Extinction erases not only species, but interactions, co-evolved partnerships, specialized pollinator-plant bonds. Microbial consortia finely tuned to given nutrient cycles. The loss of these links can degrade ecosystem function in ways that are disproportionate to the number of species lost. Conversely, the erasure also liberates ecological roles. Functions such as large-bodied herbivory or reef building may re-emerge. Under new architectures, sometimes coalescing into solutions that are convergent with earlier forms, sometimes entirely novel. The record thus shows both repetition and invention, a dialectic of constraint and creativity. The climate consequences of these biological changes are profound and two-way. Life alters climate as much as climate alters life. So a perturbation that collapses ecosystems can feed back to amplify or dampen its initial forcing. Consider the sequestration of carbon. Forests and soils lock away carbon on timescales of centuries to millennia. Their rapid loss through fire, dieback, or erosion can release large stores of CO2 and methane, accelerating warming and changing ocean chemistry. Conversely, the expansion of photosynthetic biomass in post-crisis intervals can draw down atmospheric carbon and stabilize temperatures over long spans. The presence or absence of key functional groups matters. Calcifiers that store carbon as carbonate, sediments, deep-sea organisms that bury organic matter, methanotrophs that oxidize potent greenhouse gases. Each contributes to the climate ledger in ways an external observer might read. As the planet's own control loops, feedbacks operate at multiple velocities. Fast variables, surface temperature, atmospheric CO2, primary productivity swing within years to centuries. Slow variables, ice sheet mass, deep ocean carbon stores, continental weathering fluxes, integrate over millennia to millions of years. A perturbation can push fast variables beyond thresholds and, through hysteresis, lock the slow variables into new settings. Tipping points are dangerous because they represent qualitative shifts. Once a glacial ice sheet or a carbon store moves past a certain inflection, reversal may be effectively impossible on human timescales. In the laboratory metaphor, the system's memory is layered. Some experimental outcomes are ephemeral, others permanent. If mass extinctions are resets, they are also forensic laboratories. They illuminate hidden couplings, how nutrient cycles hinge on particular clades, how oxygen concentrations modulate the possibility space for large body plans, how weathering rates link to mountain uplift control, CO2 drawdown over geologic ages. From these episodes, an observer could extract general principles. What architectures of biodiversity confer robust function? Which metabolic configurations are fragile under heat and acid? Which dispersal networks best preserve gene flow across wrenching landscape change? Those are the sorts of lessons an experimenter would value, whether the motivation is curiosity, preservation, or the optimization of survivability. Yet the evidence itself is problematically partial. The same geological machinery that creates gradients and archives also erodes the record. Tectonic shuffles sediments. Diagenesis obliterates delicate organics. Erosion strips away layers. A mass extinction can leave a dramatic isotope excursion in carbonate, a layer of soot and ash, or a sudden shift in fossil assemblages. But the full narrative, who lived where, the precise sequence of ecological collapses, the milliseconds of biochemical stress, is often lost. That erasure imposes ambiguity on any interpreter. Was the proximate cause an impact, volcanism, runaway greenhouse, or some catalytic interplay? The same ambiguity would bedevil any intelligence trying to decipher whether those trials were natural experiments or interventions. Survivorship also imposes interpretive biases. The organisms that leave clear fossil remains, skeletonized creatures, shell builders, trees, provide a coarse view of past biotes. Microbes, soft-bodied organisms, and ephemeral communities seldom fossilize well, yet they often do the critical work of ecosystem engineering and recovery. Thus, the dataset of recovery is skewed toward conspicuous taxa. Much of the functional scaffolding that supported reassembly can remain invisible to long-term observers. That invisibility complicates attempts to reconstruct the full mechanism of regeneration. The idea that mass extinctions act as resets in a laboratory sense suggests an economy of trials: purge, reseed, observe. But not every reset is equally informative or desirable. Some perturbations are so severe they dramatically prune the tree of life, limiting the repertoire of future experiments. A sterilizing event that removes the substrate for complexity would be a failed trial. The persistence of biodiversity across many catastrophic episodes suggests an intrinsic robustness in the living world. Redundancy of function, spatial heterogeneity that shelters diversity, and metabolic flexibility that allows life to ride out extremes. If an external observer was selecting sites for long-term study, the capacity of a system to bounce back might be what makes it valuable, an arena in which both failure modes and robust recovery can be examined. Human thought naturally draws parallels. Modern anthropogenic forcing, rapid greenhouse gas release, habitat fragmentation, biotic homogenization resembles an externally induced perturbation in its speed and global scale. The Paleorecord offers analogs and warnings. Abrupt warming reorganizes marine and terrestrial communities in ways that are difficult to reverse. The loss of keystone functions can cause cascading failures, and feedback, such as permafrost thaw, can amplify human-driven changes in runaway ways. The difference lies in agency and time frame. Where past upheavals were primarily natural, today the agents are biological and cultural. The controls are in hand. That fact reframes responsibility. If the planet has been the site of repeated trials, then the present age stands out because one species has acquired the capability to alter variables at planetary scales, and thus to choose whether to act as steward or as careless perturbator. Equally important is the question of detectability. If an observer set out to distinguish natural mass extinctions from interventions, what evidence would be decisive? Isotopic excursions that are temporarily correlated with unusual concentrations of particular elements might hint at unusual causes. Abrupt spikes in alien synthetic compounds, persistent anomalies in isotopic ratios of rare metals, or structured deposits inconsistent with known geochemical pathways could be legible signals. But the planet's archives are lossy, chemical signatures diffuse, and tectonic processes can bury or distort traces. As a result, inferential confidence will always be probabilistic. The ambiguity itself is part of the experimental result. The more scrupulous the observer, the more they must tolerate uncertainty. There is also a moral lesson embedded in the biological consequences of trials. Life's capacity to adapt its repertoire of survival strategies has been earned through cycles of stress and opportunity. Many of the ecological functions modern humans rely upon are legacies of past recoveries. Nutrient-rich soils that formed after millennia of organic accumulation, reefs that rebuilt slowly after cycles of bleaching, forests that sequestered carbon over centuries. To disrupt those functions quickly is to erase experiments in progress whose outcomes might have been informative for the future. From the standpoint of a species that contemplates the possibility of being observed, the ethical imperative is to preserve the integrity of ongoing experiments, to archive biological diversity, to protect refugia, to maintain gradients that allow natural trials to continue without being preempted by avoidable collapse. Finally, the pattern of survivors and losses reframes how meaning is assigned to a planetary history. Mass extinctions can be read as narrative punctuation marks, cataclysmic commas that rewrite who is center stage. But they are also technical operations, adjustments that reveal the architecture of resilience. For listeners and readers in the present, the lesson is at once aesthetic and practical. The drama of extinction produces sorrow and wonder. The science of recovery offers practical guidance for stewardship. The two belong together. To witness the ledger of losses is to feel the weight of transience. To study the trajectories of survivors is to learn the parameters of endurance. Whether the tests are the caprice of blind physics or the design of a distant observer, the biological and climatic consequences converge on a single civic lesson: stewardship matters. If the planet's long history is an anthology of trials, then the current chapter is one where human choices have real force. The ledger of survivors and the memory of resets demand humility, an ethic that values archive and resilience over short-term gain. It asks of any intelligence that reads this planet's strata a practice of cautious intervention, to preserve the conditions for future experiments, to maintain the diversity that permits recovery, and to regard the capacity to alter global variables, not as proof of mastery, but as a call to care. In the hum of deep time, the biological consequences of each trial are both data and admonition. They speak to the limits of endurance and to the obligations of those who can change the settings on the bench. What if the long narrative of the planet were not a continuous book at all, but a library of scattered pages, some charred, some torn, some tucked away in margins no one has yet pried open? That image is less a metaphor than a methodological posture. Humans can read only a few pages of a vast, layered logbook. They can lift a fragment of sediment, unroll an ice-cold bubble, decode a mineral isotope, and from these glean a sentence or two. But the design, if design there ever was, remains largely beyond reach. The question that follows is at once simple and unnerving. In the absence of the whole record, are humans the readers of this book? Or are they merely an entry within it, data typed into someone else's ledger? The difficulty begins with incompleteness. Geological memory is generous in its scope and miserly in its fidelity. Sedimentary layers collect evidence like slow-growing film, but they do not preserve every gesture. Plate tectonics scrapes away gallery after gallery, soils oxidize artifacts, microbial action blurs organic signatures until molecules become ghosts. Humans, operating on lifespans measured in decades, extract meaning from registers that conflate scale, time, and diagenetic distortion. A carbon isotope excursion here, a spike in iridium there, a sudden faunal turnover, each is a sentence fragment. To infer narrative from fragments requires an imagination tempered by constraint, models, analogues, and probability. Yet even the best inference is partial, a best guess stitched from the margins. That partiality produces a characteristic epistemic posture, provisionality. Scientists speak with numbers and confidence intervals. Storytellers speak with metaphor and doubt. Both are, of necessity, tentative when addressing the long ledger. The planet's archives are not neutral data repositories. They are palimpsests where physical processes erase as they record. Plate subduction consumes the very strata that might hold the clearest testimony. Oxidation and diagenesis alter biomarkers. Later, biological activity superimposes new chemistry on older signatures. Each readout is an entanglement, signal and noise braided together. The consequence is clear. Any claim about intent, about intervention, about design runs into a wall of ambiguity. The deepest lessons are about limits, what can be known reliably, how confidently patterns can be generalized, and where patience and humility must prevail. Cognitive limits compound geological ones. The human brain evolved to parse the world on timescales relevant to survival. Seconds of motion, seasons of food, generations of kin networks. Deep time inference asks a neural architecture tuned to immediacy to make sense of processes that unfold across hundreds of thousands to millions of years. That mismatch creates systematic biases. Pattern seeking becomes a virtue and a vice. The mind will gladly construct a satisfying narrative from fragmentary evidence, sometimes seeing intentionality where stochasticity suffices. Apophenia, the tendency to detect meaningful patterns in random data, can seduce thinkers into grand stories. Conversely, statistical subtlety and the probabilistic character of geological processes are often counterintuitive. Humans prefer stories with agents and causes. The planet's ledger is more often a log of interactions among gradients, feedbacks, and stochastic shocks. Timescale blindness also works another way. Events that are catastrophic on geological terms, mass extinctions, flood basalt eruptions, rapid greenhouse pulses, can still be rare compared to the planet's full history. Conversely, processes that look gradual in the geological archive may, in human terms, be catastrophic because of speed. The human epoch civilization's imprint has introduced perturbations that operate on a velocity entirely different from many natural baselines. That disjunction feeds both hubris and horror. It is tempting to read anthropogenic change as unique. On the grounds of speed and global reach, it is also worth remembering that Earth's past contains episodes of profound, rapid reconfiguration. The reader who lacks a feel for these nested tempos risks overinterpreting their significance, or worse, misattributing cause. This is where the philosophical question sharpens. Are humans observers, or are they data? The categories are not mutually exclusive, but each lens reframes ethical and epistemic priorities. Seen as observers, humans are the species that has evolved the capacity to translate the planet's fragments into generalized knowledge. They develop methods, radiometric dating, isotopic modeling, stratigraphic correlation to extend partial readings into systemic understanding. The observer role confers responsibility. Observers curate archives, protect fragile records, and build institutions meant to carry memory across the very timescales the planet demands. The moral register of observation emphasizes stewardship, preserving the context that make interpretation possible, resisting interventions that would erase the traces by which the planet's history can be read, and cultivating humility about what certainty is possible. Seen as data, humans become part of the ledger they study. They are a system state recorded in isotopes, in manufactured compounds entombed in sediments, in extinctions written in fossil absence. From the vantage of an external intelligence, or even of an internal systems perspective, humanity's technological artifacts, altered atmospheres and engineered biospheres, are signals. They are indices of a particular perturbation to the planetary machine. This framing strips agency from some of the moral stories humans tell about themselves. Instead of an autonomous moral actor, humanity becomes in part a variable in a larger experiment, a realization of a set of boundary conditions pressed to test their consequences. The tension between these readings is not merely academic. It shapes decision-making. If humans are observers first, their duty is to protect the integrity of the record and to minimize interventions that make future inference impossible. If humans are data, then the moral horizon expands. Every action contributes to the record and to the state of the system. There is a responsibility to consider the footprint left. But whatever interpreters, whether future human inquisitors, other intelligences, or hypothetical external observers, will read it, the two perspectives converge on one practical imperative: to act with foresight and restraint. There is, however, a more subtle and perhaps more honest stance: reflexive co-constitution. Humans are both readers and entries in the logbook. Their acts of observation alter the system they study. Their technological reach becomes a new variable in the planetary console. This reflexivity is not merely symbolic. Scientific sampling disturbs environments. Preservation activities sometimes remove materials. The act of documenting a fragile ecosystem can increase its desirability and thus its exposure. Observers change the observed. That realization reframes the ethics of inquiry. Curiosity must be tempered by an awareness of its footprint. Institutional designs that once valorized comprehensive collection now confront questions about minimal invasion and long-term stewardship. The research agenda becomes not only what can be known, but what should be preserved and for whose scrutiny. Limits of cognition impose methodological disciplines. First, an awareness of selection bias must be institutionalized. Which archives are being read most often and which remain neglected? Iconic sites attract attention and funding, creating skewed pictures. Remote, photogenic landscapes become overinterpreted, while vast, less conspicuous sedimentary deposits, deep ocean clays, continental silts remain undersampled despite their potential information density. Second, probabilistic thinking must be normalized in public discourse. Communicating uncertainty without sacrificing urgency is a civic art as much as a scientific one. It asks institutions to teach audiences how to live with claims that are robust in direction but tentative in detail. Third, methods must be diversified. Single proxies carry single modes of failure. Composite reconstruction across independent lines, paleoclimate proxies, paleobiological indices, geochemical fingerprints reduces the risk of misreadings. Preservation itself becomes an act of epistemic solidarity with the future. If humanity can only read a few pages now, it owes future readers a richer repository. That requires deliberate choices, legal and cultural protection for paleontological sites, investments in long-duration archives that can survive political cycles, and the foresight to store not only objects, but the metadata that makes them interpretable. The planet's logbook is not merely physical strata, it is the context around those strata, the who, how, and when of sampling, the preservation of stratigraphic relationships, the conservation of intangible knowledge about methods. Without such metadata, a scrap of alloy or a peculiar isotope ratio remains an inscrutable object. The moral calculus therefore includes archival ethics. Who gets to decide which pages are saved? And how will those decisions shape the narratives future intelligences reconstruct? There is also the question of signaling. If an external observer exists who can interpret planetary traces, what would a responsible species do? Would it leave overt signatures, deliberate markers that survive geological disturbance, or would it adopt a policy of low impact? Humility? The answers depend on values. A species that wishes to be discovered might endeavor to embed robust, deliberately patent artifacts in long-lived materials, zircon-hosted microstructures, resistant alloys buried at predictable stratigraphic intervals. A species that fears surveillance might choose a different strategy: distributed redundancy, biological seeding that leaves no persistent synthetic traces, or even a cultural ethos of concealment. The mere possibility of being read by an intelligence outside the system complicates the ethics of persistence and communication. The limits of cognition, however, are not purely deficit. Constraint fosters creativity. Working with fragments stimulates methodological innovation, new proxies, novel statistical frameworks, simulations that run hypothetical histories and test them against measurable patterns. The recognition that only a few pages can be read encourages an epistemic humility that is also epistemic patience. It favors slow-burning, long-horizon institutions, a culture of cumulative knowledge building that prizes continuity over novelty and depth over spectacle. The archival turn is both moral and practical. If the planet's ledger is partial, then conserving what remains becomes the highest duty of any observing species. There is, finally, a philosophical humility embedded in the question, observer or data. Even if some intelligence beyond the planet once designed experiments here, that fact would not necessarily simplify human moral life. Knowledge of being observed would change perspectives, but not absolve responsibilities. Whether observed or autonomous, the species that now holds the technological capacity to alter planetary variables must confront the same set of pragmatic choices: preserve the record, minimize irreversible harm, and sustain the conditions that allow future intelligence, whatever form it takes, to read, to learn, and perhaps to care. The logbook analogy returns in part as an ethical litmus test. Pages torn out, burned, or removed without context are losses not only of information, but of relational possibility. Future interpreters, descendants, external intelligences, or later forms of life will read what is left and fashion meaning from the margins. The stewardship question is therefore also a question of generosity across time. What obligations do present observers owe to future readers? If the planet's archives are a commons, then the civic virtue is restraint. If they are an inheritance, the moral act is conservation. So the dilemma endures. Humans can read neither the whole design nor, perhaps, justify themselves by appealing to a cosmic end designed for their benefit. The gap between the few pages they can decode and the totality they aspire to know is not merely cognitive, it is ethical, political, and existential. It presses on questions of public policy, how to fund long-term archives, how to train practitioners in probabilistic thinking, and on deeper cultural questions. What myths and narratives will a species cultivate when its self-image oscillates between reader and entry? If there is consolation in this discomfort, it is that partial knowledge can still be dignified and responsible. To be an observer need not mean to claim mastery. To be data need not erase agency. Reflexivity, recognition that observation alters the observed, should temper curiosity with care. Practices matter. Invest in redundancy. Protect stratigraphic contexts. Document methods thoroughly. Fund institutions that will outlast electoral cycles. And cultivate cultural habits that value preservation over immediate consumption. In the thin room left by doubt, there is a pragmatic choreography. Measure carefully. Archive meticulously. Act modestly. Whether humans are the audience of a cosmic drama, specimens in a remote experiment, or co-authors of the planet's ongoing story, the only directly accessible domain of moral action is the present. There, with limited pages in hand and a vast library concealed by time, the species must choose how to leave its mark, as an erosive hand that tears out pages for instant gain, or as a careful conservator who recognizes that the true experiment of stewardship is to keep the archive legible for those who will read it long after any individual human voice has gone silent. What if the most defining question of the present moment is not what humanity will do to the planet, but whether the planet, and whatever minds beyond it, are watching what humanity does? The question sits like a quiet probe at the center of contemporary life. Is the planetary experiment now being logged in real time? Not only in the slow strata of rock and ice, but in streams of electromagnetic pulses, stored bits, and institutional reports? The inquiry reframes the immediate crisis: accelerating climate change, species loss, and industrial transmutation of chemistry as both an ecological emergency and an epistemic test. How does a technological species behave when its acts are visible at planetary scale? There is a blunt, almost technological answer. Earth is indeed being recorded, in a way and at a scale never before possible. A global web of instruments now reads temperature, carbon concentration, ocean acidity, glacier mass, deforestation rates, methane plumes, and biodiversity indices. Satellites orbit in predictable constellations, the sensors tuned to spectral bands that reveal chlorophyll stress, nocturnal luminosity, and the thermal signatures of cities. Thousands of autonomous drifting buoys transmit sea surface data. Acoustic recording arrays eavesdrop on whale song and the grinding of ice. Air sampling networks bottle the atmosphere and analyze isotopic ratios down to the parts per trillion. For the first time in geological history, one species has created a sampling machine that monitors continuously and in detail many of the variables an external observer would consider decisive. That material fact that the planet's variables are now digitized changes the experimental problem. In earlier epochs, the record was slow and lossy. Change is left, signatures smeared across layers, subject to erosion, subduction, and diagenesis. Contemporary signals are different. They are granular, time-stamped, and preserved in distributed servers, satellite archives, scientific databases, laboratory freezers, and replicated cloud backups. The Anthropocene is a palimpsest written concurrently on ice cores and in terabytes. Plastics, synthetic radionuclides, novel isotopic compositions, and a unique chemical cocktail of combustion byproducts will register in sediments for millions of years. Concurrently, real-time telemetry transmits the unfolding story of ice loss, ocean stratification, and urban expansion. For any attentive observer, human or hypothetical extraterrestrial, this dual archive is rich and noisy. The geological layer will tell a slow, long-term tale, a persistent technofossil horizon characterized by microplastics, alloy residues, sudden enrichments in anthropogenic radionuclides, and a marked spike in certain carbon isotopes consistent with fossil fuel burning. The technological archive, by contrast, is a live feed, methane readings in the Arctic, The spatial explicit collapse of coral bleaching events, satellite-detected deforestation fronts, carbon dioxide curves rising and falling in near real time. Both are forms of recording, both will invite interpretation, but recording is not the same as interpretation. The presence of sensors does not guarantee insight. An external intelligence with a capacity for long temporal integration might either be indifferent to the telemetry or fascinated by the unique convergence of a biosphere and a technosphere. If the observer's interest is to test reaction to perturbation, the contemporary human moment is a particularly telling variable set. Humans are both the authors and subjects of rapid change. They amplify greenhouse forcing, alter land cover, and rewire ecological networks even as they deploy monitoring systems, predictive models, and mitigation strategies. In experimental terms, technology, social organization, and collective awareness are new parameters, not merely passive outputs, but active variables that alter system trajectories in real time. The emotional register that accompanies the knowledge of being recorded is ambivalent and complex. On one hand, there is a peculiar reassurance in visibility. Recording can be a form of accountability. When forests burn and satellites record ash plumes, the existence of an immutable remote archive makes denial difficult. It provides leverage for policy, legal action, and global cooperation. On the other hand, visibility generates exposure, shame, and a sense of being judged. The same cameras that document industrial pollution also expose inequality, inequitable vulnerability, and political failure. The awareness of an external gaze, whether cosmic, future human, or institutional, presses a social psychology into being. Performative mitigation, symbolic acts intended for the record, and the strategic shaping of narratives to appear responsible while systemic drivers continue. There is also a subtler cognitive shift. When a species learns it is being observed, its behavior can change in predictable ways. Social media and ubiquitous surveillance technologies have taught modern societies how the sense of an audience alters habits. Conservation of image can outpace substantive reform, and attention economies can reward spectacle over sustained action. At planetary scale, this amplification may manifest as gestures designed to look good in the record, temporary emissions, reductions timed for international summits, headline-friendly reforestation campaigns that prioritize rapid canopy cover over long-term ecosystem function, or geoengineering proposals framed as salvage rather than as interventions with hard-to-reverse consequences. The result can be an experimental confound. The observer's presence modifies the subject's behavior, rendering the test itself less informative about natural capacities for resilience and more reflective of image management. Yet technology is two-faced here. The same instrumentation that might tempt performative gestures is also the species' most powerful tool for effective response. High-resolution climate models translate satellite data into projections that inform infrastructure decisions. Early warning systems based on sensor networks save lives during floods and heat waves. Real-time ocean acidity monitoring enables targeted interventions to protect vulnerable fisheries. Technology, when coupled with rigorous institutions and equitable governance, increases the capacity to act prudently. The current moment can therefore be read as a meta-experiment in agency, given the capacity to detect and predict planetary stress. Will social systems respond in time and at scale? The variable of social organization complicates the interpretation even further. Scientific telemetry is valuable only insofar as societies can turn knowledge into policy and practice. Where political systems are fractious, where economic incentives reward short-term extraction, and where media fragment attention, detection does not necessarily yield correction. From the vantage of a patient observer, the rate-limiting factor may not be the availability of data, but the social will to change. Conversely, in societies that align governance with long-term stewardship, that invest in resilient infrastructures, conserve refugia, and prioritize decarbonization, the live recording becomes a mechanism for better outcomes. The experiment thus shifts from the planet's physical parameters to the cultural and institutional variables that mediate human responses. Collective consciousness matters. The spread of environmental literacy, the cultivation of cross-cultural empathy, and the emergence of transnational institutions capable of enforcing environmental commitments are social variables that alter system trajectories in ways no geophysical perturbation alone can. A species that internalizes the ethics of deep time will behave differently than one that treats the present as a disposable moment. The contemporary global conversation, mediated by education, media, art, and law, is in effect a social experiment. Will communities converge on sufficient collective action to keep variables within thresholds that preserve options for future complexity? There is another, more speculative dimension to present contact. The possibility that an external observer could interpret the current surge of techno-signatures as intentional signaling. Artificial illumination at night, broadband radio emissions, neutrino observatories, and directed transmissions leak into space. Earth's radiosphere has been audible across interstellar distances for a century, more concentrated. High-power transmissions continue to be emitted by both civilian and military systems. If an intelligence beyond the planet is scanning for signs of technological manipulation, the Anthropocene is broadcast loudly. It would read not merely as geological noise, but as evidence of an organism capable of global modification. That fact raises ethical questions about whether a species should intentionally send clearer signals or cultivate a quieter footprint, and whether the desire to be noticed might be a form of hubris or a necessary step towards cosmic conversation. Whether such external attention exists, however, remains speculative. Pragmatically, the more immediate question is local and human-facing. How will the current generation react when the planet is simultaneously being recorded by its own instruments and becoming increasingly changed by collective actions? The present has already produced varied experiments in response. Some societies invest in mitigation, decarbonizing energy systems, restoring wetlands, protecting coral nurseries, and building resilient cities. Others pursue adaptation alone, accepting loss in some regions while shoring up wealthier enclaves. Still others double down on extractive pathways, betting politically or economically on the inertia of existing systems. Each strategy is a variable with consequences that will be visible in both the immediate telemetry and the longer geological horizon. There is also the emergent variable of deliberate geoengineering, an experimental category that raises both technical and moral complexity. Solar radiation management, large-scale carbon removal, and ocean alkalinity enhancement are interventions designed to alter planetary variables with aims of stabilizing climate. In the laboratory metaphor, these are controlled perturbations introduced by the experimenters themselves. They offer potential to reduce immediate harms but carry high uncertainty. Local climate patterns could shift unpredictably. Precipitation regimes could be altered, and ocean chemistry could be shifted in ways that pose novel stresses to marine life. If the planet is being recorded, such interventions will be registered as deliberate, large-magnitude changes. They will also foreground the ethical dilemma of who gets to choose interventions and who bears the risks of unintended consequences. The knowledge that safeguarding the record matters gives rise to a different kind of stewardship ethic, archival responsibility. Preservation is no longer merely a cultural taste, it becomes a methodological necessity. Scientific data must be carefully curated so that future interpreters, whether descendants, other intelligences, or even a future civilization's archaeologists, can reconstruct past decisions. That requires not only physical conservation of cores, samples, and artifacts, but the maintenance of metadata, procedural notes, calibration routines, chain of custody documents. It is a form of generosity across time, ensuring that the story of this era remains legible, with context intact, so that later readers can learn not only that certain changes occurred, but why choices were made. Emotions shape these choices. Shame, pride, resolve, and dread act as motivators and impediments. Collective shame over environmental degradation can be paralyzing or mobilizing. Pride in technological prowess can be a spur to remedy or a justification for continued dominance. Dread can catalyze protective policies or devolve into fatalism. Understanding these affective dynamics is itself part of the contemporary experiment. Societies that channel anxiety into constructive institutions and policies fare differently from those that channel it into denial or scapegoating. There is also the moral logic of reciprocity. If recording makes action visible, then transparency cultivates accountability. Open data, shared archives, and participatory monitoring democratize the record, enabling communities to verify claims and to hold actors to account. Conversely, secrecy creates the possibility of masked interventions, of policies that appear benign in the public feed but are ecologically devastating in reality. The transparency variable is therefore as important as the physical variables being measured. Finally, the question returns to motive. If an external observer is indeed watching, what motive might they assign to humanity's current behavior? An interpreter could see a species conducting a frantic experiment in atmospheric control, risking systemic thresholds in pursuit of energy and short-term prosperity. Or they might see a species that, upon recognizing its power, mobilizes to constrain itself and preserve the conditions for diversified futures. The ambiguity is the same ambiguity human historians already confront. Evidence can be read as adaptive intelligence or as reckless short-sightedness. What can be controlled in this noisy, recorded age is the conduct of humans themselves. The technological capacity to record the planet also bestows the capacity for informed intervention. The ethical and political challenge is to align incentives, cultivate institutions capable of sustained stewardship, and preserve the integrity of the record for future inquiry. Whether or not some extraterrestrial archive is indexing these developments, the best practical reason to act responsibly is the presence of fellow humans and future beings who will inherit the consequences. In the end, the question, is it being recorded, resolves into two concurrent facts. Yes, the planet is being recorded, both by machinery of observation and by the indelible mark of anthropogenic materials woven into sediments. And yes, that recording changes behavior. It creates the potential for accountability, but also for performance. The decisive variable is human will, the choice to translate visibility into effective, equitable action rather than into mere spectacle. The present contact, the recognition of being watched by instruments, by history, and by possible external minds, can be corrosive or catalytic. If it is to be the latter, the response must be measured, transparent, and guided by a long-lens ethics that values preservation, restores systems where feasible, and refrains from reckless experiments whose results may be recorded but not reversed. That, perhaps, is the truest test of this era, whether a species that can be seen at planetary scale will live in a way that future readers can interpret with dignity rather than dismay. If the Earth were indeed a testing ground, the question that follows naturally enough is not merely who set the apparatus in motion, but how and when the experiment might conclude. A laboratory has endpoints, a run finishes, data are collected, notes are filed, reagents are disposed of. But planetary-scale trials unfold on timescales that frustrate those tidy metaphors. The very idea of an end stretches and buckles under deep time. Termination could be a moment, an intentional act that severs processes and removes traces, or it could be asymptotic, a fading of attention as the observer's priorities shift. It could be a reset that scrubs the slate and begins anew, or a conservation, a decision to keep results intact as part of a cumulative archive. Each possibility refracts differently through human thought, solace and terror, opportunity and grief. An experiment ends when the question it sought to answer has been resolved to the satisfactions of its investigator. That criterion, however, assumes the existence of a single question and a single judge. In the more plausible plural, the observer's objectives may be layered. Some questions are short, some long, some are about mechanism, some about contingency, some are taxonomic, some about ethics. For a patient intelligence that reads deep time like a single file, end might mean the exhaustion of parameters worth sampling. For a machine optimized for efficiency, termination occurs when a sufficiently accurate model has been fit to data and predictions fall below a threshold of uncertainty. For a curator with aesthetic aims, termination might never come. The archive is worth tending so long as novelty remains. For an entertainment-driven observer, the end is when the narrative no longer surprises. Those abstract logics can be mapped onto plausible modes of planetary closure. One is definitive termination. An agent actively sterilizes or removes evidence, collapsing the experiment into a closed state. Sterilization could be literal, an intentional reset by impact, by massive atmospheric rearrangement, or by extraction of the biosphere, or it could be archival erasure, where synthetic or geological traces are physically removed. Another is archival preservation. The agents withdraw and secure a record, taking samples off-world or embedding redundant time capsules in resilient materials. A third is indefinite observation. The trial continues as background. With occasional interventions but no closure, Earth becomes a long-term monitoring station. A fourth, hybrid scenario is cyclical resetting. The bench is periodically cleared. Runs begin again under slightly modified boundary conditions to explore different parameter spaces. Each yields distinct signatures and distinct human responses. If the experiment conclusion were an intentional act performed by an external intelligence, what might that act look like to an interpreter limited to terrestrial archives? An abrupt sterilization would leave unmistakable scars, a global layer of oxidized residues, isotopic anomalies, a sudden depauperation of organics, the termination of biological cycling. But the planet's own geological machinery also produces abrupt endings. Giant impacts and flood basalt events are part of Earth's independent repertoire of large perturbations. Discriminating between natural terminal events and purposeful ones is epistemically fraught. The signatures an outside agent would leave, if they wish their act to be legible, could be different, highly ordered, improbable isotopic patterns, embedded durable artifacts in resistant mineral phases, or systematic manipulations of planetary dynamics that could not plausibly be geological. Yet those marks would still face the slow tooth of erosion, tectonics, and chemistry. The longer the delay between the closing act and any attempted human reading, the more likely the traces will be diffused. Preservation, by contrast, offers a different script. If the objective were knowledge accumulation, an observer might elect to conserve the data. That preservation could assume many forms. The most direct is exfiltration, physical samples removed, catalogued, and stored off-world in stable repositories with metadata. Another is in situ, deep sequestering, deliberately burying an archive in a geological formation chosen for stability, zircon crystals, deep mantle origin xenoliths or ultramafic layers resistant to alteration together with redundant copies placed across planetary plates to hedge against subduction. A subtler form is the creation of persistent signals, long-lived isotopic markers, or engineered mineralogical anomalies that would survive diagenesis and signal intentionality to future analyzers. Each preservation strategy presumes a calculus of time and risk. Where will the record last longest with least ambiguity? The choice between erasure and conservation is not only technical, it is ethical. To wipe is to deny continuity, to save is to value posterity. If the observer contemplates Earth's inhabitants as moral subjects, beings whose suffering and flourishing matter, then the inclination to preserve suggests an ethic of stewardship. If the observer treats Earth strictly as an information source, the calculus might favor either route depending on the importance of subsequent runs. Entertainment-driven motives could bias toward repeated spectacle, reset, and watch again, while curator motives incline toward archival fidelity. For humans, the possibility of termination or of deliberate preservation by an external mind produces a kaleidoscope of responses. There is, first, a cognitive dissonance. The species already grapples with its own temporal limitations, and the added dimension of being observed or at risk of being deleted intensifies existing anxieties. There is an instinct to record, to leave markers that will survive. Across cultures, this impulse has led to monuments, mythologies, and caches, cruder analogues of the time capsules that would be sensible in the face of deliberate erasure. In a world that imagines its fate could be sealed by a distant agency, the urgency to inscribe becomes moral as well as practical. Preserve language, art, genes, and knowledge in formats chosen for durability. What formats are durable across geological timescales? Material resilience narrows choices. Silica glass, certain ceramics, native noble metals, and refractory mineral inclusions store information in ways that resist alteration. Equally important is contextual metadata. A durable object without context, an alloy nugget or a carved slab, may read as an anomaly, but its meaning will be contested. Metadata, the how, the when, the chain of custody gives a future interpreter the tools to make sense of a relic. Thus, preservation is as much about curatorial practice as material engineering, who encodes the key. What redundancy patterns are written? How is the arc of knowledge distributed across locales to tolerate partial loss? If the experiment will be reset and its contents erased, an intelligent species might attempt a counter-strategy. Diffusion rather than concentration. Seeds are scattered instead of stored in a single vault. Cultural knowledge is embedded in many media, distributed social practices, and living organisms less dependent on fragile monuments. The logic echoes biological contingency. Redundancy begets resilience. For humans, this would suggest dispersal strategies, off-world settlements, biological backups, and culturally embedded memory practices designed to survive both planetary perturbations and the erasure of obvious monuments. Yet the problem is trickier still. Any action taken to preserve could itself be interpreted by an observer as interference. The very variable their experiment seeks to measure. If the agents running the test aim to see how an intelligent species responds to the knowledge of being observed, then human attempts at preservation, at broadcasting, or at concealment are themselves part of the data. In that reflexive setting, the ethics of action are doubly charged. Preserve at the risk of changing the experiment's outcome, or refrain and risk total loss. There is no neutral option in a lab where actors can see the lights. A striking corollary is the question of detectability. Would the ending of an experiment be signaled in ways accessible to human inquiry? In many scenarios, the answer is no. A termination enacted in the physical manipulation of planetary scale variables could be indistinguishable from natural catastrophe. A deliberate exfiltration of samples might leave no trace on the surface at all. Even a visible act of erasure could be preceded by centuries of subtle manipulations that human scientists would struggle to attribute. The paleo record offers tantalizing glimpses, anomalous, isotopic excursions, unexplained declines and renaissances, but ambiguity reigns. The only signals likely to be unequivocal are those designed to be interpretable by a species with human-like inferences. Patterned structures embedded in refractory materials, mathematics encoded in isotopic ratios, or artifacts placed in stratigraphic contexts that defy naturalization. An intelligence intent on making its actions legible could design such markers. One indifferent or secretive would not. Because of this epistemic opacity, human reaction must prioritize agency in the present. If the end of a world run could erase everything, the rational human response is not paralyzing speculation, but constructive caretaking, archivism, redundancy, stewardship, and the spread of knowledge beyond a single planetary biosphere. These steps have both pragmatic and moral logics. Pragmatically, off-world seeding, sending genetic libraries, cultural records, and durable artifacts into stable orbits or to other bodies reduces single-point failure risk. Morally, the act of creating a wider, distributed archive affirms the non-trivial value of the present life system. It declares that the stories, the songs, the technologies, and the lives are worth saving even if their authors cannot predict the terms of their retention. There is a cultural dimension to this response as well. Societies that internalize the possibility of erasure may develop rituals of preservation that are not only technical but also symbolic. Practices that bind communities to long-term projects, ceremonies to seed archives, communal guardianship of vaults, and narratives emphasizing continuity serve both as practical redundancy and as psychological inoculation against despair. The sense of being on a fragile stage can either immobilize communities or galvanize their best collective capacities. Cultures that combine humility with industrious archivalism will fare better at leaving intelligible traces. An opposing impulse to accept impermanence as a metaphysical baseline. If erasure is probable or inevitable, some philosophies might counsel a focus on goodness in the brief span, a cultivation of values not conditioned on legacy. That reframing is not fatalistic resignation. It is an ethical stance shaped by the recognition that agency can be meaningful, even without long-term recording. Yet even this existential humility often coexists with the archival instinct. Communities that accept impermanence still bury time capsules, mark geological layers, and tend seed banks. Human beings are reflexively both ephemeralists and record keepers. There is also a deeper, speculative answer to the question of duration. Perhaps the experiment never ends, in the human sense, because it is not designed to. If the observer's purpose is to accumulate comparative data across many iterations of planetary dynamics, they may choose a regime of rolling observation, periodic nudges, long patience, and selective interventions that catalyze certain branches of complexity while leaving the main structure intact. In this model, the test runs until the observer's model is saturated with information, or until the observer's own conditions change. Internal evolution, resource reallocation, extinction of the observing intelligence, or strategic pivoting. The end is then a matter of institutional longevity rather than a planetary denouement. For human analysts, this possibility is both consoling and discomposing. Consoling because it suggests the chance of salvage, discomposing because it places human fate in the hands of processes entirely out of species control. Finally, the question of whether results are kept or wiped has an internal analog. Humans themselves have become experimenters on a planetary bench. The decisions made now, industrial growth, conservation, geoengineering, or migration into space, are acts of manipulation of a system that may be subject to external observation. The ethics of that role echo the earlier speculations about outside agents. If humanity chooses to alter variables without due care, it risks producing irreversible changes that will be recorded and interpreted by any future reader, human or otherwise. If it chooses preservation and humility, it increases the possibility that the record of this epoch will be coherent, instructive, and perhaps legible to minds beyond. Whether the experiment ends through erasure, preservation, or ongoing observation, the prudential lesson remains the same. Deep time imposes a kind of moral mathematics. The longer the time scales involved, the greater the obligation to minimize irreversible harm and to distribute the burden of memory. Practically, this implies investments in durable archiving, the dispersal of genetic and cultural lineages beyond a single planetary cradle, the protection of ecological refugia that preserve functional diversity, and a political culture oriented toward the stewardship of traces. Epistemically, it implies an attitude of modesty. Claims about intentionality must be weighed against the planet's natural capacity to confound. In the quiet margins of that contemplation lies a human truth. If someone beyond the sky has been reading this world as data, if the bench has been observed, then the stakes of moral action do not vanish. The presence of a spectator does not absolve responsibility, it intensifies it. If, on the other hand, there is no watcher, and Earth's apparent test-like features are the result of physics and chemistry alone, the obligation is still real. Either way, the choice to preserve, to distribute, and to act with humility is the most effective insurance against an ending that would be total and untranslatable. So when might the experiment end? Perhaps never in the sense of a final curtain. Perhaps it will conclude in hundreds, thousands, or millions of years when the observer's aims are met or their institute dissolves. Perhaps it will end suddenly, in an act that leaves inscrutable traces. Or perhaps it will evolve into an archive, a long-term repository curated by intelligence with patience enough to wait through epochs. Whatever the truth, the sensible human response is not to await a cosmic verdict, but to do the practical work of preservation and prudence now, because the only ending that is certain in its relevance to the living is the one shaped by choices made in this brief human moment. What would it mean to live as if each morning were not merely the preface to a day, but a recorded datum in a long experiment whose author is unknown? That provocative framing sits at the hinge of the final argument. It asks not for proof of design, but for a posture of practice. A way for a species that can read sediments and satellites to comport itself while the ledger remains ambiguous. Whether Earth is a curated archive, a test bench, a theater, or simply an exquisitely contingent outcome of physics and chemistry, a single ethical horizon remains clear. Life is precious, and the proper attitude toward it is responsibility. The first layer of that responsibility is epistemic, to accept uncertainty without surrendering agency. The planet's record is partial by design and fate. Sedimentary pages are lost to subduction, organic molecules are reworked by heat and pressure, isotopic whispers are reinterpreted across decades of science. Those gaps demand a humility of inference. They also demand relentless investment in the means of reconstruction. The marked recommendation is thus simple and technical. Build and sustain institutions that outlast electoral cycles, whose sole purpose is to expand and curate the archive. That means adequately funded paleoscience, open data networks for satellite telemetry, long-term storage solutions for biological samples, and cross-cultural repositories for intangible heritage. It means radically improving metadata practices so that every core, every sample, every recording comes with the contextual notes that make interpretation possible centuries from now. Beyond the scientific scaffolding lies a moral calculus. If the record must be legible, then present actions should, as far as possible, preserve that legibility. The species that will be a responsible steward treats the archive as a commons, not a spoil to be pillaged. Preservation here is practical. It implies legal frameworks that protect stratigraphic sites from careless excavation and mining, conservation programs that prioritize ecological refugia and the maintenance of functional diversity, and international agreements that regulate persistent pollutants likely to fossilize as ambiguous technofossils. It also implies cultural practices that resist the commodification of unique and fragile landscapes. It means curating visitation, restricting destructive tourism, and valuing quiet observation over spectacle. But preservation alone is not enough. The long laboratory metaphor highlighted earlier carries a more immediate injunction. Do not confuse curiosity with license. Experimenters in a laboratory are bound by ethics. The planet's scale magnifies the consequences of any test. The recommendation is therefore to adopt a planetary ethic of precaution, where interventions, geoengineering, large-scale species translocations, or widespread industrial alteration are proposed. They should be pursued only after subjecting them to the same rigorous risk assessment that governs human clinical trials. That requires transparent modeling, adversarial testing of assumptions, wide public engagement, and governance structures that can be held accountable beyond short political cycles. Experimental humility must be institutionalized, pilot programs limited in space and time, independent oversight, and explicit exit criteria so that an intervention can be terminated if it proves harmful. The ethical frame slides naturally into a social policy program. Stewardship requires distributive justice. The ledger of deep time does not care for contemporary inequities, but ethical watchers must. Those most vulnerable to climate shocks and biodiversity loss are frequently those least responsible for the emissions in land. Conversions that drive them. A humane and philosophically coherent response therefore couples environmental preservation to social justice, climate mitigation that redistributes benefits, ecosystem restoration that employs and empowers local communities, and the protection of cultural landscapes in ways that respect indigenous knowledge systems and sovereignty. Responsibility is not only an ecological technicality, it is a social covenant. At the level of everyday comportment, the recommendation is both practical and existential. Treat each day as a small, living result worth tending. This is not mere asceticism. It is a calibration of values. If the planet's past demonstrates that small experiments, microbial metabolisms, genetic variants, local cultural practices can scale into planetary consequences, then everyday practices become meaningful. Individual and communal decisions about consumption, land use, food systems, energy habits, and civic engagement compound. The ethic of each day, a result, reframes ordinary choices as contributions to a long experiment whose outcomes might be read by future descendants or by any intelligent interpreter. Concretely, this approach invites a change in cultural metrics. Society should expand their notion of accounting beyond quarterly growth to include measures of option value, the preservation of functional biodiversity, the stability of water tables, the retention of soil carbon, and the integrity of coral reef architecture. Economic systems might incorporate long-horizon discounting that diminishes the short-term premium on extraction in favor of durable resilience. Urban planning should privilege green infrastructure, thermal comfort, and local food systems that reduce systemic vulnerability. Education systems should cultivate deep time literacy so that citizens can sensibly weigh short-term gain against generational risk. In these ways, the mundane becomes a vector of cumulative prudence. The archival impulse must be complemented by redundancy. Deep time fragility is real. Tectonics buries, chemistry erases, cultural memory dissolves. Prudence therefore calls for distributed backups, biological, cultural, and informational, seed banks, forensic-grade archival libraries stored in multiple stable geologies, and decentralized digital repositories reduce the chance that a single catastrophic event will remove all traces of a civilization's knowledge. Off-world redundancy, sending curated libraries, genomes, and durable artifacts into stable orbits or to other bodies of the solar system must be pursued, not as an act of escapism, but as insurance, a complement to careful stewardship of the home bench. Such projects should be collaborative and governed by transparent international norms so that the impulse to safeguard does not become a race for private bunkers and unequal futures. An attitude of restraint must also be married to an ethic of repair. Where possible, humanity should choose restoration over replacement, rebuilding over relocation when feasible and equitable. Rewilding, reforestation, restoration of kelp and seagrass beds, and the rehabilitation of degraded soils are acts that restore gradients and feedbacks crucial to system health. Restoration is not a guarantee of return to a prior baseline. It acknowledges that new equilibria may emerge. But it is also an investment in maintaining the palette of possibilities. The recommendation here is to prioritize actions that preserve functional diversity, those species and processes that maintain nutrient cycling, pollination, water filtration, and carbon sequestration, because these are the substrates of future resilience. The laboratory metaphor teaches another subtle lesson. Observe actively, but interfere modestly. Curiosity drives discovery. Restraint preserves future questions. Practically, that duality suggests a research ethic that emphasizes non-invasive monitoring where possible. Satellite remote sensing, passive acoustic arrays, environmental DNA sampling over mass excavation, and favors minimally destructive testing. Where intervention is necessary, it should be explicitly for the protection of experiments in progress, creating refugia, translocating particularly endangered genotypes when extinction is imminent, and reintroducing keystone species to restore function. Interventions intended purely for knowledge without benefit to the observed systems should be critically weighed against their harm. The collective narration of human action, however, demands more than governance and technology. It requires cultural practices that cultivate a durable sense of responsibility. Rituals of stewardship may be as small as seasonal public days for soil and seed tending, a civic state-mandated restoration quotas, or as broad as a reinvigorated civic religion of care that infuses education, media, and art. The human propensity for myth and symbol can be leveraged to sustain attention over long periods. Museums of lost institutions that curate the stories and specimens of species and landscapes gone can function both as memorial and as moral tutor. Art can translate deep time rhythms into forms that sensitize the public to slowness and scale. In short, culture must internalize a new set of habits that hold the long view in daily life. The ethics of being recorded also call for transparency. The presence of a global telemetry network binds communities to accountability. Data should be open, replicable, and available to diverse stakeholders. Transparency fosters trust and enables corrective action. It also mitigates the risk that public relations will replace substantive reform. Openness in science and policy reduces the temptation to perform for an audience at the expense of making systemic changes. Yet the deepest recommendation is philosophical. Cultivate a stance of reverent curiosity paired with practical stewardship. Reverence acknowledges awe, the delight at a reef's riotous life, the astonishment at a microbial mat's alchemy, the beauty in the choreography of plate, mantle, and sea. Curiosity drives inquiry, pushes the development of better instruments, and inspires the art and science that make possible more informed care. Stewardship binds both to action. It translates wonder and knowledge into policies, obligations, and daily behaviors that minimize harm and maximize future possibility. This triad, reverence, curiosity, stewardship, forms a coherent ethic because it bridges scales. Reverence grounds the emotional life. Curiosity informs the cognitive. Stewardship operationalizes the moral. Together they form the practical philosophy recommended for a species that stands on a bench of water, air, and fire with the capacity to alter the experiment. They reject the arrogance of assuming entitlement to the apparatus and the paralysis of fatalism. Instead, they promote a posture of engaged humility. There is also a pedagogical dimension to this philosophy. Institutions should teach not only facts but modes of attention, how to read a core sample as one might read a diary, how to interpret a change in chirp patterns as an early warning, and how to recognize slow variables even as crisis flares. Education for deep time trains citizens to weigh present pleasures and profits against the open-ended catalogue of futures. It cultivates patience, a taste for redundancy, and an appreciation for the invisible scaffolding that supports life. Finally, the recommendation is existential. Whether or not the bench is being observed by an outside intelligence, human action will be recorded in geologic and digital strata. That dual recording should be a spur to dignity. Living responsibly, treating each day as a recorded result, is a practice of humility and generosity. It is an acknowledgement that the present generation is both beneficiary and trustee of a system built by deep time processes and by countless generations of organisms. Every decision to conserve a wetland, to reforest a slope, to fund a repository, or to teach a child the grammar of slow change is a vote for a future in which the experiment continues productively. The final counsel, therefore, is neither speculative nor mystical. It is practical, ethical, and demanding. Act as if the planet matters in itself, not merely as a resource, but as an archive of possibilities. Treat each day as a contribution to a ledger that may be read by future intelligences or by descendants who will stand where we stand and ask what was done. Preserve the contexts that make interpretation possible. Cultivate institutions and cultures that prize long horizons over immediate spectacle. Invest in redundancy and in distributed stewardship so that a single catastrophe cannot erase an entire library of living knowledge. And finally, adopt a personal ethic in which ordinary acts, care for soil, restraint in consumption, participation in civic repair are seen as meaningful investments in a shared future. In that posture, life on Earth regains its central significance regardless of metaphysical status. Whether the planet is a testbed, a museum, a stage, or an accidental jackpot of chemistry, the living world's value remains intrinsic. The right attitude is not resignation to cosmic indifference, nor exhilaration at being chosen. It is the sober commitment to cherish, to conserve, and to act as careful custodians of a singular laboratory that holds within it the only known instance of life's deep experiment. Living responsibly and regarding each day as a result worth preserving is the philosophy that best honors the fragile, fleeting, and profound gift of life on earth.